Hi everyone, welcome back to the Red Umbrella channel. I hope you're all doing well today. In this video, we'll be breaking down two insane theories for every Family Guy character, perfect to fall asleep to or just relax with. But before we begin, I'd just like to kindly ask you all to subscribe. It's completely free and it really helps us improve the videos for this wonderful community we've managed to build. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's begin. First up, we got Peter Griffin. The entire show is in Peter's mind. One of the most unsettling theories in Family Guy lore argues that none of what we see actually happens. According to a popular idea that emerged from Reddit discussions, Peter Griffin lost his entire family in a drunk driving accident he caused, and everything we watch across hundreds of episodes exists only inside his broken mind. The theory suggests Peter created an elaborate fantasy world where he can undo death, reverse time, and keep his family alive forever because he cannot accept what he did. This explains why characters die and come back with no explanation, why injuries heal instantly, and why the show resets after every episode like nothing happened. When you look at the evidence from the actual show, this theory finds support in dozens of canonical moments that suggest reality itself bends around Peter's consciousness. The foundation of this theory rests on how death works in Family Guy. Brian dies after being hit by a car in one episode, and the entire Griffin family mourns him for weeks. Stewie eventually uses a time machine to prevent Brian's death, and suddenly Brian is alive again, with nobody remembering he died except Stewie. The show presents this as a genuine timeline change, but it also demonstrates that death has no permanent meaning in this universe. Characters can die and return without consequence because the rules of reality do not apply. If Peter created this world in his guilt-ridden mind, after killing his real family while driving drunk, it makes sense that he would build a reality where death can be reversed. He needs his family to come back no matter what happens, because facing their permanent absence would destroy him completely. Brian serves as perhaps the clearest window into Peter's psyche in this interpretation. Brian represents everything Peter wishes he could be. He is educated, cultured, well-read, and politically aware. Peter himself is overweight, crude, and often ignorant, but Brian embodies the intellectual side Peter suppresses or never developed. When Peter talks to Brian, he is essentially talking to an idealized version of his own conscience. Brian also has a drinking problem that mirrors Peter's own alcoholism, but Brian frames his drinking as sophisticated wine consumption rather than cheap beer. This allows Peter to process his addiction through a character who makes substance abuse look refined rather than destructive. The fact that Brian is a dog rather than a human creates emotional distance. Peter can explore his demons through Brian without directly confronting them as his own failures. When Brian dies, Peter's subconscious cannot handle it, so Stewie fixes everything by traveling through time. Peter needs Brian because Brian is the part of himself that still thinks and reflects. Stewie Griffin presents an even stranger case. Stewie is a baby who builds time machines, creates clones, travels to parallel universes, and possesses technology that exceeds anything in our reality. Sometimes characters understand Stewie perfectly, and other times they treat him like a normal infant who only babbles. The show has never clearly established whether people actually hear Stewie talk or if his elaborate schemes happen at all. This inconsistency makes perfect sense if Stewie represents Peter's desire to control time and reality. After causing an accident that killed his family, Peter's mind invented a character who can manipulate time itself. Stewie can go back and fix mistakes, which is exactly what Peter wants to do with his own life. Stewie's genius intellect also compensates for Peter's lack of education and planning. Through Stewie, Peter explores what it would mean to have unlimited power and intelligence. The fact that Stewie is simultaneously a baby and a supervillain suggests he exists more as a concept than a real person. He is Peter's fantasy of starting over with perfect knowledge while also being Peter's rage and desire for control made manifest. Lois Griffin operates as Peter's idealized wife who somehow tolerates everything he does. Real marriages break under far less stress than what Peter puts Lois through in the show. He has endangered her life countless times, humiliated her publicly, forgotten their anniversary repeatedly, and committed numerous acts of stupidity that would drive any real person to divorce. Yet Lois stays and continues to love him despite everything. She gets angry in individual episodes but always forgives him by the end. If Peter created this fantasy world, of course he would invent a version of his wife who never truly leaves him, no matter what he does. The real Lois died in the accident Peter caused, and he cannot cope with knowing she died hating him or being disappointed in him. Fantasy Lois forgives everything because Peter desperately needs her forgiveness. The show occasionally hints at darker aspects of Lois's character, including her past with wealthy men and her occasional affairs, but these moments seem designed to make Peter feel less guilty about his own failures as a husband. If Lois is not perfect either, then Peter can tell himself their relationship was complicated rather than facing the truth that he destroyed something good. Meg Griffin stands out as the family member everyone treats with contempt and cruelty. Peter openly tells Meg he does not love her. The family uses her as a verbal punching bag, and multiple episodes center on how nobody values her existence. This makes no sense in a real family, but becomes chilling in the context of the theory. If Peter killed his family while drunk, Meg might represent the guilt he feels about his daughter specifically. Perhaps the real Meg suffered most in the accident, or perhaps Peter had a troubled relationship with his real daughter that he never resolved. In his fantasy world, Peter recreates Meg but keeps her at a distance through constant mockery. He cannot love fantasy Meg because doing so would force him to confront how much he loved and lost his real daughter. The abuse Meg endures serves as Peter's self-punishment projected onto her. Every cruel joke about Meg reflects Peter's internal voice telling himself he deserves to suffer for what he did. The show even featured an episode where Meg finally stands up to the family and explains that she accepts their abuse because it keeps the family together, suggesting that her role as a punching bag serves a psychological function for everyone, especially Peter. Chris Griffin appears as a simpler character who echoes Peter's personality but younger and less formed. Chris loves art and drawing, which represents a creative outlet Peter never pursued. If this fantasy exists in Peter's mind, Chris embodies the potential Peter sees in his son, the person Peter wishes he had become. Chris is overweight like Peter but still has time to develop differently. He is stupid in similar ways to Peter but has not yet made the kinds of catastrophic mistakes that define his father's life. Chris also receives more affection from Peter than Meg does, possibly because Peter can accept a son who resembles him, but cannot accept a daughter he failed to protect. The show sometimes depicts Chris as disturbed or strange, such as when he has an evil monkey living in his closet that eventually turns out to be real. These moments hint that even in his fantasy, Peter cannot keep everything perfect. Darkness seeps in through Chris because Peter's subconscious knows something is deeply wrong. The extended cast around the Griffin family supports this theory and how they function more as archetypes than fully realized people. Joe Swanson is the perfect friend who always forgives Peter despite being paralyzed, in part due to adventures with Peter. A real person in Joe's situation might harbor resentment, but Joe remains loyal because he exists in Peter's mind as the friend Peter wishes he deserved. Cleveland Brown moved away for several seasons but eventually came back, and the show barely acknowledged his return. His presence depends entirely on whether Peter's fantasy needs him at any given moment. Quagmire serves as Peter's ID, the sexual impulses and dark desires Peter cannot admit to himself. Quagmire commits acts that would result in imprisonment in reality, but in Peter's fantasy world, Quagmire faces minimal consequences because he represents desires Peter has but refuses to own. When Quagmire occasionally turns on Peter and reveals he hates things about him, these moments feel like Peter's self-awareness breaking through the fantasy to remind himself what he really is. The structure of Family Guy episodes themselves supports the theory that everything exists in Peter's damaged mind. Almost every episode follows a pattern where Peter does something stupid, causes a disaster, faces consequences, and then everything resets by the next episode. The family forgives him, injuries disappear, and life returns to exactly where it was before. Real life does not work this way. Actions have permanent consequences and relationships break down over repeated betrayals and failures. But in a fantasy world created by someone who cannot accept consequences, everything can reset endlessly. Peter can make the same mistakes over and over because he is essentially trapped in a loop of his own guilt. He recreates scenarios where he fails his family but then gets another chance to try again. The reset button serves as Peter's inability to move forward from the trauma of what he did. The cutaway gags that define Family Guy's comedy also fit this theory disturbingly well. Peter constantly references experiences and memories that make no logical sense, such as meeting various celebrities or living through historical events. These cutaways happen in the middle of regular conversations, and other characters rarely acknowledge them. If the entire show exists in Peter's mind, the cutaways represent his thoughts wandering, his mind jumping from one association to another the way a traumatized or intoxicated person might lose focus. Peter cannot maintain a consistent reality even in his own fantasy because his mind is too damaged. The cutaways show his consciousness fracturing and rebuilding constantly as he tries to escape the truth of what he did. The show has featured multiple episodes where characters acknowledge they are in a television show or where reality breaks down entirely. In one episode, the family discovers they are cartoon characters being watched by live-action humans. In another, everything turns into a Conway Twitty concert, inexplicably. These moments are played for comedy, but they also suggest that the reality of Family Guy is unstable and aware of its own artificiality. If Peter imagined everything, his subconscious occasionally breaks through to remind him that none of this is real. The characters acknowledge being cartoons because that is what they are in Peter's mind, constructs and drawings rather than actual people. Death and violence in Family Guy happen constantly without lasting impact. Peter has been shot, stabbed, blown up, and injured in ways that would kill normal humans dozens of times over. He falls down and clutches his knee for an extended period as a running gag, yet he never goes to a hospital or deals with chronic pain. Characters regularly kill each other in cutaway gags or flashback sequences without any legal or moral consequences in the main narrative. This complete disregard for mortality makes sense if Peter's mind created a world where death cannot truly happen because he cannot process the real deaths he caused. He needs violence to be meaningless so he can avoid confronting the meaningful violence he committed. The show's flexible timeline also supports this theory. The Griffins have been a family with teenage kids for over 20 years of real-world time, but the characters do not age. Stewie remains a baby episode after episode despite years passing. The show sometimes references modern technology and current events, proving that time moves forward in some sense, but the family stays frozen at the exact ages they were when the show began. If Peter created this fantasy after killing his family, he would naturally freeze them at the ages they were when they died. He cannot imagine them growing older because they never got that chance. His fantasy allows him to keep them exactly as they were in that last moment before everything went wrong. Peter's relationship with alcohol connects every aspect of this theory. Peter drinks constantly throughout the series, and his alcoholism drives numerous plots. He gets drunk and makes terrible decisions that endanger everyone around him repeatedly. The show plays this for laughs, but in the context of the theory, Peter's drinking is both the cause of his trauma and his method of maintaining the fantasy. If he killed his family while driving drunk, he might continue drinking in his fantasy world as a form of slow suicide or as a way to maintain the mental state that allows the fantasy to continue. He cannot sober up because sobering up might mean facing reality. The Drunken Clam, where Peter spends time with his friends, serves as his refuge from even his own fantasy. When the fantasy becomes too painful, Peter retreats into literal drunkenness within the fantasy itself. Certain episodes hint more directly at the darkness underneath Family Guy's comedy. In one storyline, Peter discovers he is mentally disabled due to a genetic condition. This revelation is eventually reversed through surgery, but it raises questions about Peter's mental state and whether he can accurately perceive reality. In another episode, Peter experiences a stroke and temporarily loses his ability to function, showing vulnerability and fear that rarely appear in the show. These moments crack the comedy to reveal a damaged person underneath. If the entire show exists in Peter's mind, these episodes represent his awareness trying to break through his delusions. His fantasy occasionally cannot hold, and the truth of his mental state becomes briefly visible before he buries it again. The show's approach to continuity also matters here. Family Guy occasionally references previous episodes and maintains running gags, but it also completely ignores its own history when convenient. Characters forget major events, relationships reset without explanation, and the show contradicts itself constantly. This selective memory mirrors how traumatized minds work. Peter remembers what he wants to remember and forgets what threatens his fantasy. The inconsistency is not a writing flaw, but a feature of how damaged consciousness operates. Real memories mix with imagined ones until everything blurs together. Looking at the show through this lens transforms every joke into something darker. When Peter fights a giant chicken across multiple episodes and elaborate action sequences, it represents his mind trying to process rage and violence through absurdist distance. When the family travels through time or visits parallel universes, Peter's consciousness is trying to explore what his life might have been if he had made different choices. When characters directly address the camera or comment on the show's structure, Peter's awareness of his fantasy's artificiality briefly surfaces before being suppressed again. Every episode becomes a coping mechanism, a story Peter tells himself to avoid the unbearable truth. The theory suggests that Peter sits somewhere, perhaps in a psychiatric facility or perhaps still at the scene of the accident, playing out these scenarios in his mind, while his real body remains trapped in the consequences of what he did. Everything we watch as viewers is his desperate attempt to keep his family alive in the only way he can, through imagination and delusion. The comedy exists as a defense mechanism, turning tragedy into farce because farce can be endured while tragedy cannot. Peter laughs because if he stops laughing, he will have to scream. This interpretation does not require every fan to accept it as the true explanation for Family Guy. The show works perfectly well as simple comedy without deeper meaning, but the theory persists because the evidence sits right there in canonical episodes. The show has given us all the pieces to construct this darker reading, and once you see it, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Whether intentional or accidental, Family Guy contains within itself the story of a man who destroyed everything he loved and built a fantasy world where destruction never matters, where death can be undone, and where he gets infinite chances to be with his family despite deserving none. In Peter's mind, the show goes on forever because stopping would mean facing what he did, and that remains impossible. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the second Peter Griffin theory, which suggests that Peter is already dead or trapped in some kind of purgatory. Another theory that haunts Family Guy discussions suggests Peter Griffin is already dead and has been for years. According to this interpretation, Peter died during one of his countless near-death experiences early in the series, and everything that follows takes place in a purgatory specifically designed around his personality and sins. Quahog is not a real town in Rhode Island, but a liminal space where Peter cycles through endless moral tests, constantly failing and constantly being given another chance. The theory argues that the show's chaotic nature, its refusal to follow normal logic, and its cyclical structure all point toward a reality that exists outside normal time and space. When you examine the actual episodes and how the show functions canonically, the evidence for Peter existing in some form of afterlife becomes genuinely compelling. The foundation of this theory requires identifying when Peter actually died. Several episodes in the early seasons feature moments where Peter should have died, but somehow survived. In one episode, Peter fights a giant chicken named Ernie in an extended battle that destroys much of Quahog. They fall from incredible heights, crash through buildings, and inflict injuries that would kill any human being multiple times over. Peter walks away bruised but alive. In another early episode, Peter goes into a coma after a stroke and experiences what seems like an out-of-body experience. He wakes up at the end, but the theory suggests he never actually woke up in reality. That coma marked his transition from life to purgatory, and everything afterward exists in this in-between state. The show never confirms he fully recovered because he did not recover. His consciousness simply continued in a different realm, while his real body died. The structure of purgatory in religious tradition involves souls working through their sins before moving to heaven or hell. The souls experience situations designed to teach them lessons and help them recognize their moral failures. Peter Griffin cycles through hundreds of episodes where he commits sins, hurts people, faces consequences, and then resets without having learned anything. Each episode presents Peter with opportunities to be a better person, and each episode ends with him failing or succeeding only temporarily before the next episode begins with him back at square one. This pattern mirrors exactly how purgatory is supposed to function. Peter is being tested repeatedly, given chances to grow and change, but he cannot escape because he fundamentally refuses to learn. The purgatory of Quahog is tailored specifically to him, filled with temptations and challenges that expose his worst qualities over and over. Death in Family Guy happens constantly without making sense in terms of normal reality. Characters die and come back with no explanation. Brian dies and returns through time travel. Peter himself has died multiple times across various episodes and always comes back. In one episode, Peter literally goes to heaven, meets God, and is sent back to Earth. The show treats this as a temporary visit, but in the context of purgatory, Peter's encounter with God takes on different meaning. He was already dead when he arrived in heaven, and God sent him back to purgatory because Peter has not finished his trials. The casual relationship with death in the show suggests that everyone in Quahog exists in a space where death has already happened, and what comes after is just different forms of existence. The other characters in Quahog function as elements of Peter's purgatory rather than real people with their own independent existence. Lois serves as Peter's moral anchor, the person who represents what he should value and protect. She forgives him endlessly because purgatory gives Peter infinite chances to get things right with her. Each time he betrays her, hurts her, or takes her for granted, he fails a test. Each time he shows her love or makes a genuine sacrifice for her, he passes a small test. But the tests never end because Peter has not fundamentally changed. Lois exists in this space as both his reward and his trial. The person he could have if he becomes worthy, but who remains just out of reach because he keeps failing. Brian operates as Peter's conscience and guide through purgatory. In many religious and literary depictions of the afterlife, souls have guides who help them navigate their trials. Brian is intelligent, educated, and often tries to steer Peter toward better choices. He also shares many of Peter's flaws, particularly alcoholism and self-destruction, which makes him an imperfect guide. This imperfection makes sense in purgatory because Peter's guide would reflect his own damaged moral compass. Brian cannot save Peter because Brian himself is flawed, possibly another soul working through his own purgatory alongside Peter. Their friendship represents two damaged souls trying to help each other while both being incapable of real change. When Brian dies temporarily, it shakes Peter's entire world, because losing his guide means losing the one voice that occasionally pulls him toward redemption. Stewie Griffin represents something more supernatural in this interpretation. A baby who builds time machines, creates clones, and possesses godlike technology does not belong in normal reality. In purgatory, Stewie could be a demon or trickster figure whose role is to tempt Peter and create chaos. Stewie's schemes often put the family in danger, and his presence ensures that peace never lasts in the Griffin household. Alternatively, Stewie could represent an angel or neutral force, testing Peter through absurd challenges. His ability to manipulate time makes sense if time does not function normally in purgatory. Stewie can reset events, create alternate timelines, and undo deaths because the realm Peter inhabits is not bound by linear time. Every loop and reset that Stewie causes serves purgatory's purpose of giving Peter another chance to learn. Meg's role in the family becomes even darker in this interpretation. Peter treats Meg with cruelty and rejection throughout the series, and she absorbs abuse from everyone. In purgatory, Meg might represent Peter's greatest failure, perhaps a daughter he neglected or hurt in life. She exists in his purgatory as a constant reminder of how he failed as a father. He cannot love her properly because his guilt prevents it, so he keeps her at a distance through mockery. Meg's suffering serves as Peter's punishment and his test. If he could show her genuine love and recognize her value, he might pass an important trial, but he never does. The family even acknowledges in one episode that Meg's role is to be the target of abuse to keep everyone else stable, which sounds exactly like a purgatory mechanism where one soul suffers to maintain the system. Chris mirrors Peter but younger, representing who Peter was before he made his worst mistakes. Chris has time to become someone better, but he keeps following Peter's example, suggesting that even in purgatory, Peter cannot stop corrupting the people around him. Chris should serve as Peter's chance at redemption through guiding his son properly, but instead Peter teaches Chris his worst habits. This repeated failure marks another test Peter cannot pass. Quahog itself operates according to rules that make no sense in normal reality. The town experiences apocalyptic events regularly, yet everything always returns to normal. Buildings explode and rebuild overnight. The town has been destroyed by various disasters and somehow remains intact by the next episode. The geography of Quahog changes depending on what the plot requires, with locations appearing and disappearing without explanation. These impossible qualities make perfect sense if Quahog is not a real place, but a constructed environment that reshapes itself according to the needs of purgatory. The town serves Peter's trials, so it provides whatever settings and situations will test him most effectively. When Peter needs to face consequences for his actions, disaster strikes Quahog. When the trial is over, everything resets because purgatory does not accumulate permanent damage. The citizens of Quahog exist as extras in Peter's purgatory, appearing when needed to create situations that test him. Mayor Adam West, who governed Quahog for most of the series, behaved in completely insane ways that no real politician could get away with. His bizarre behavior makes sense if he is not a real person, but a manifestation of purgatory's chaos. He exists to create absurd situations that force Peter into moral choices. Other recurring characters like Herbert the Old Man or Consuela the Maid appear episodically to serve specific purposes in Peter's trials, and then fade into the background until needed again. They have no real lives outside of their interactions with Peter because they are elements of his purgatory rather than independent souls. Peter's friends, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland, function as different aspects of Peter's personality and different types of souls in purgatory. Joe is permanently paralyzed but maintains optimism and remains a good person despite his suffering. He represents the person Peter could become if he accepted his limitations and focused on being decent despite his flaws. Joe's paralysis might be his own purgatory trial, but he handles it with grace, showing Peter an example of proper behavior that Peter ignores. Quagmire embodies pure sin without restraint. He commits acts of sexual depravity constantly and faces minimal consequences, representing how sin can become normalized when practiced openly enough. Quagmire serves as Peter's dark mirror, showing what happens when someone embraces their worst impulses completely. Cleveland seems the most normal of the group, representing ordinary goodness, but even he gets dragged into Peter's chaos regularly. These three friends create a spectrum from virtue to vice, and Peter sits in the middle, pulled in both directions without committing fully to either path. The show has featured multiple episodes where reality breaks down entirely or where religious and supernatural elements appear directly. Peter has met God, Jesus, and death as literal characters who interact with him. God appears as a real entity who acknowledges Peter's existence and makes decisions about his fate. Death becomes Peter's friend in multiple episodes, appearing as a physical being who can be defeated or manipulated. These encounters are treated as comedy, but they confirm that the supernatural operates openly in Quahog. In normal reality, people do not meet death and play games with him. In Purgatory, where the boundary between life and death has dissolved, such encounters become possible. Peter's casual interactions with cosmic entities suggest he exists in a realm where the divine and mortal intersect constantly. One particularly significant episode features Peter dying and going to heaven, where he meets historical figures and deceased relatives. He receives judgment and is eventually sent back to Earth to continue living. The show frames this as a temporary visit, but in the Purgatory theory, Peter seeing heaven makes sense because he is already dead. Heaven exists as something he can glimpse but cannot yet enter because he has not completed his trials. God sends him back, not to life but to continued purgatory. Peter's confusion about being alive suggests he does not fully understand his own state of existence. He thinks he is alive because purgatory convinces souls they are still living, so they can properly experience their trials. The cyclical nature of every episode supports the purgatory interpretation perfectly. Peter starts each episode in essentially the same state as he began the series. He has the same job, the same family structure, the same friends, and the same personality. Despite experiencing thousands of adventures and consequences, Peter never fundamentally changes. He learns lessons within individual episodes but forgets them by the next one. This eternal return to the starting point mirrors Purgatory's function of repeating trials until the soul learns and grows. Peter cannot progress because he refuses to change, so Purgatory keeps resetting him to try again. The fact that the show has continued for over 20 years with the characters aging not at all suggests time operates differently in their realm. They are frozen in an eternal cycle because they exist outside normal time. The violence Peter endures and inflicts should have killed him or landed him in prison countless times. He has committed manslaughter, destroyed property worth millions, assaulted people, and endangered his family repeatedly. In reality, Peter would be in jail or dead. In Purgatory, consequences manifest differently. Peter can experience violence and punishment without permanent death because he already died. Legal and moral consequences work differently because the realm exists to test souls rather than enforce earthly justice. Peter faces consequences within episodes but never accumulates a permanent record because each reset wipes his slate clean for the next trial. This makes no sense in reality but perfect sense in Purgatory, where the same soul receives infinite chances. Certain episodes directly reference hell, damnation, and eternal punishment. In one storyline, Peter worries about going to hell and tries to become a better person. He fails, of course, and returns to his normal behavior. The show treats his fear of hell as a temporary concern, but that fear makes sense if Peter exists in Purgatory and knows on some level that hell remains a real possibility. He is being tested to determine his final destination, and his failures keep pushing him toward damnation, while his occasional good acts keep him in the balance. The show's writers might not intend this interpretation, but they have included enough references to the afterlife and divine judgment that the pieces fit together. The extended flashback episodes and alternate reality episodes take on new meaning in Purgatory. When the show depicts Peter's life before the main series or shows alternate versions of events, these could be Purgatory showing Peter different paths his life could have taken. He sees versions of himself making different choices, experiencing different outcomes as part of his moral education. Purgatory uses these visions to help Peter understand where he went wrong and what he could have been. The fact that these alternate realities feel as real as the main timeline suggests that all timelines exist equally in this space outside normal causality. Peter's relationship with alcohol becomes central to understanding his Purgatory. He drinks constantly throughout the series, and drinking leads to many of his worst decisions. If his death in reality was alcohol-related, his Purgatory would naturally involve continuing temptation by alcohol. Each time he drinks excessively, he fails a test. Each time he chooses alcohol over his family, he proves he has not learned. But the alcohol is always available at the Drunken Clam, always offered by his friends, always presented as a normal part of life. Purgatory tempts him with the exact substance that destroyed him. testing whether he can resist or moderate his consumption. He never does, so the cycle continues. The drunken clam itself might be a kind of way station within purgatory where souls gather between trials, explaining why the men spend so much time there doing nothing but talking and drinking. The show occasionally breaks the fourth wall, with characters acknowledging they are in a television show or speaking directly to the audience. These moments crack the illusion of reality and suggest that the characters have some awareness of their artificial existence. In purgatory, souls might experience moments of lucidity where they recognize they are not truly alive. Peter's fourth wall breaks represent his consciousness briefly understanding his true situation before purgatory reasserts its hold on him. The show-within-a-show quality of Family Guy mirrors how purgatory might function as a constructed reality that occasionally reveals its own construction. Physical spaces in the show behave impossibly. The Griffin house is bigger on the inside than makes architectural sense, with rooms appearing and disappearing as needed. The house has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times without explanation. These spatial impossibilities suggest that the house, like Quahog itself, is not a real physical structure but a manifestation of Peter's purgatory. The house provides whatever space the story requires because it serves the trials rather than following architectural logic. Similarly, Peter's workplace at the brewery follows no real company structure and provides endless opportunities for him to cause disasters without being fired. The workplace exists to test Peter's responsibility and work ethic, not to function as a real business. Time in Family Guy has been explicitly shown to work strangely. Stewie has time machines, characters travel to the past and future, and events happen out of sequence without explanation. The show has lampshaded its own timeline inconsistencies multiple times. This temporal chaos makes perfect sense if the show takes place outside normal time. Purgatory exists between life and death, potentially outside linear time entirely. Past, present, and future might all exist simultaneously in this realm, allowing for the temporal confusion the show displays. Peter experiences time as a loop because that is how purgatory functions for him. The strangest episodes, including those with talking animals, supernatural beings, and complete breaks from reality, support rather than contradict the purgatory theory. In a realm designed to test souls, absolutely anything can happen. The rules of reality do not apply because this is not reality. When Peter fights a giant chicken across multiple episodes in battles that destroy city blocks, purgatory is testing his capacity for sustained violence and revenge. When the family encounters aliens, ghosts, or magical beings, purgatory is introducing supernatural trials. Everything that seems impossible in reality becomes possible in an afterlife realm, where the only limits are what serves the purpose of testing and teaching souls. Peter's lack of growth over hundreds of episodes is the strongest evidence for this theory. Real people change over time through experiences and consequences. Peter experiences more extreme consequences than most people face in entire lifetimes, yet he remains fundamentally the same. He has lost jobs, friends, respect, and nearly lost his family dozens of times, yet he never truly learns. This makes no sense for a living person, but perfect sense for a soul in purgatory who has not yet earned release. Peter cannot move forward until he changes, but he cannot change because of his fundamental character flaws, so he remains trapped. The show continues indefinitely because Peter's purgatory continues indefinitely. He will cycle through these trials until he finally learns and grows, and since that may never happen, the show can theoretically continue forever. The comedy of Family Guy serves as a coping mechanism within purgatory itself. Peter turns his suffering into jokes because direct confrontation with his damnation would be unbearable. The show's humor distances viewers and Peter himself from the darkness underneath. Every joke about death, violence, or moral failure is Peter's soul trying to process his situation through laughter instead of screaming. Purgatory might even generate the humor as a mercy, allowing souls to endure their trials through comic framing rather than pure torment. The laughter makes the punishment bearable enough to continue, but does not eliminate the punishment itself. Whether the show's creators intended this interpretation does not matter because the canonical evidence exists within hundreds of episodes. Family Guy has shown Peter die and return, interact with divine beings, experience impossible events, and cycle through endless moral failures without growth. The show has established that death is temporary, reality is flexible, and consequences do not accumulate in normal ways. All of these elements align perfectly with Peter existing in purgatory after an early death. He remains trapped in Quahog, cycling through episodes, making the same mistakes, being given endless chances to redeem himself, and failing repeatedly. The show goes on because purgatory goes on, and Peter cannot escape until he becomes someone worthy of escaping, which he may never achieve. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Next up we have Lois Griffin is the real villain, each abusive one. A darker reading of Family Guy suggests that Lois Griffin is not the long-suffering wife holding her family together, but rather the primary source of dysfunction and abuse in the household. This theory reframes the entire show by positioning Lois as a manipulative, controlling figure who has systematically broken down Peter's personality over years of emotional abuse. According to this interpretation, Peter's stupidity and childish behavior are not natural traits, but coping mechanisms developed in response to years of being controlled, belittled, and emotionally destroyed by his wife. Lois appears sympathetic because the show frames her as the reasonable adult dealing with an idiot husband. But when you examine her actual behavior across hundreds of episodes, a pattern emerges of someone who uses cruelty, manipulation, and control to dominate everyone around her. The canonical evidence for this theory exists throughout the series in moments that are played for comedy, but reveal something far more disturbing about who Lois really is. The foundation of this theory rests on how Lois treats Peter in their everyday interactions. She regularly calls him stupid, fat, and worthless. She mocks his intelligence in front of their children and friends. She dismisses his feelings and opinions as irrelevant. When Peter expresses excitement about something, Lois shuts him down with contempt. When he tries to pursue interests or hobbies, she ridicules him until he gives up. The show frames this as a wife dealing with an incompetent husband, but the pattern matches textbook emotional abuse. Lois systematically attacks Peter's self-worth through constant criticism and mockery. She has convinced him and everyone around them that he is worthless, which gives her complete control over the relationship. Peter genuinely believes he is lucky to have Lois because she has spent years destroying his confidence to the point where he cannot imagine anyone else tolerating him. Lois's control over the household extends to every decision and every aspect of family life. She controls the finances despite Peter working full-time at the brewery. She decides what the family does, where they go, and how they spend their time. She dictates Peter's behavior and punishes him when he disobeys. The show presents this as necessary because Peter makes terrible decisions. But this framing ignores that Lois has created a situation where Peter is not allowed to make any decisions at all. She has infantilized him to the point where he acts like a child because she treats him like a child. When someone is constantly told they are incompetent and prevented from exercising any autonomy, they eventually stop trying to be competent. Peter's stupidity might be a learned helplessness response to years of Lois controlling everything and punishing any attempt at independence. The way Lois treats Meg reveals even darker aspects of her character. Lois participates in the family's abuse of Meg and sometimes leads it. She has called Meg ugly, stupid, and worthless to her face. She has forgotten Meg's birthday and important events in her life. She has prioritized her other children over Meg consistently. One particularly disturbing aspect is how Lois seems to view Meg as competition rather than as her daughter. In several episodes, Lois becomes jealous when Meg receives male attention or starts to develop confidence. She sabotages Meg's attempts at happiness and keeps her daughter in a state of low self-esteem. This behavior suggests Lois needs to be the most attractive and desirable woman in the house, and she cannot tolerate her own daughter threatening that position. A mother who sees her teenage daughter as a rival has serious psychological issues, and Lois displays this dynamic repeatedly throughout the series. Lois's background provides crucial context for understanding her abusive behavior. She comes from an extremely wealthy family, the Pewterschmidts, and married Peter against her father's wishes. The show depicts this as romantic rebellion, but it also reveals that Lois gave up a life of luxury and privilege to be with Peter. She could have married someone wealthy and lived in mansions, but instead she lives in a middle-class house in Quahog with a family she clearly resents. This decision has left Lois bitter and angry. She takes out her regret on Peter by constantly reminding him of what she gave up for him. She uses her sacrifice as a weapon to control him and justify her cruel treatment. Peter can never do enough to make up for the life Lois lost, so she punishes him endlessly for being the reason she ended up in what she sees as a lesser life. The show has revealed that Lois had a wild past before settling down with Peter. She dated wealthy men, partied extensively, and lived a glamorous life. She was engaged to someone else before Peter, and that relationship ended badly. Lois has also had a history with drugs, including cocaine use that the show references multiple times. This past suggests Lois married Peter not out of love, but as an act of self-destruction or rebellion against her family. She chose the opposite of what her wealthy parents wanted, and she has been punishing Peter for being her instrument of rebellion ever since. He represents everything she gave up, and everything she thinks she deserves better than. So he becomes the target of all her frustration about how her life turned out. Lois's affairs and sexual behavior throughout the series reveal a pattern of using infidelity as a tool of power and control. She has cheated on Peter multiple times across various episodes. She had an affair with Bill Clinton in one storyline. She has kissed other men and engaged in flirtatious behavior regularly. The show sometimes frames these moments as justified because Peter is such a terrible husband, but that framing excuses abuse. Lois uses the threat of infidelity to keep Peter insecure and desperate for her approval. She flirts with other men in front of him to remind him that she has options, and he does not. She makes him feel lucky that she stays with him despite his flaws, which gives her enormous power in the relationship. Peter lives in constant fear of losing her, which makes him easier to control and manipulate. The dynamic between Lois and Peter includes frequent physical violence from Lois toward Peter. She hits him, throws objects at him, and physically assaults him when angry. The show plays this for comedy because female-on-male violence is treated as less serious in media, but the behavior matches abuse patterns. Lois uses physical violence to enforce her control and punish Peter when he disobeys or annoys her. Peter rarely fights back and usually accepts the violence as something he deserves. This acceptance indicates he has been conditioned to believe Lois has the right to hurt him. An abusive relationship often includes one partner believing they deserve the abuse, and Peter demonstrates this belief constantly. He apologizes to Lois even when he did nothing wrong and accepts blame for problems she caused because she has trained him to take responsibility for her emotions. Lois's rage and capacity for extreme violence appear in multiple episodes where she completely loses control. In one storyline, Lois becomes a cage fighter and discovers she loves violence. She beats people brutally and finds satisfaction in hurting others. The show reveals that Lois has a deep anger that she usually suppresses, but this anger comes out when she is given permission to be violent. Her rage is not about defending her family or protecting anyone. She simply enjoys causing pain. This revelation about her character suggests the emotional cruelty she inflicts on her family comes from the same place as her physical violence. She wants to hurt people and has found ways to do it within her family that society excuses or ignores. Another episode shows Lois teaching piano lessons to students, and she becomes emotionally and verbally abusive toward them. She screams at children, destroys their confidence, and reduces them to tears. She justifies this behavior as pushing them to be better, but she clearly enjoys the power she has over vulnerable kids. Her teaching style mirrors how she treats her own family. She believes cruelty is how you motivate people, or perhaps she simply enjoys being cruel and uses motivation as an excuse. Either way, the episode confirms that Lois's abusive behavior is not limited to her relationship with Peter, but extends to anyone she has power over. The show has depicted Lois as having serious anger management issues that occasionally explode into extreme behavior. She has committed crimes including violence, theft, and more without showing remorse. In one storyline, she becomes addicted to shoplifting and continues even after getting caught because she enjoys the thrill. This addiction to breaking rules and hurting others suggests Lois has antisocial tendencies that her role as wife and mother helps her hide. She is not a good person trying her best in a difficult situation. She is someone who enjoys control, violence, and getting away with bad behavior. Her position as the responsible adult in the family provides cover for these darker aspects of her personality. Lois keeps Peter in a state of dependency that prevents him from ever leaving or improving himself. She controls his access to money, friends, and activities. She monitors his behavior and punishes independence. When Peter tries to better himself or pursue his own interests, Lois finds ways to sabotage him. She claims these interventions are for his own good, but they consistently result in Peter remaining dependent on her. An abuser often isolates and controls their victim to prevent escape, and Lois has effectively isolated Peter from any life outside of her control. He has friends, but Lois determines when he can see them. He has a job, but Lois controls the money he earns. He has interests, but Lois decides which ones he can pursue. This level of control is not normal in a healthy relationship. The way Lois responds to Peter's attempts at romantic gestures or showing love reveals how she maintains dominance. When Peter plans something nice for her, she usually finds fault with it and makes him feel stupid for trying. She sets impossible standards that Peter can never meet, which keeps him constantly trying to please her and constantly failing. This dynamic ensures Peter stays focused on earning her approval rather than questioning whether her treatment of him is acceptable. An abuse tactic called moving the goalpost keeps victims off balance by changing expectations so success becomes impossible. Lois employs this constantly. Peter can never be good enough because Lois needs him to feel inadequate to maintain her power over him. Peter's childish behavior and apparent stupidity make more sense as responses to abuse than as natural personality traits. People in abusive relationships often regress or develop learned helplessness where they stop trying to solve problems because all their attempts are met with punishment or failure. Peter acts like a child because Lois treats him like a child. He makes stupid decisions because he has been told he is stupid so often that he believes it and stops trying to think critically. He pursues childish interests like watching television and playing with toys because those are the only areas of his life where Lois allows him any autonomy. His drinking likely started or worsened as a coping mechanism for dealing with emotional abuse at home. The more broken down Peter becomes, the more justified Lois appears in controlling him, which creates a self-reinforcing cycle where his dysfunction validates her abuse. The moments when Peter shows actual intelligence or competence are revealing in this context. Peter occasionally displays skills, knowledge, or emotional intelligence that contradict his usual stupidity. He runs successful businesses in some episodes. He solves complex problems. He shows deep love for his children and friends. These moments suggest Peter is not naturally stupid, but has been conditioned to act that way. When he escapes Lois's immediate influence or when the situation is serious enough to break through his learned helplessness, his real personality emerges. He is capable of more than Lois allows him to be, and she suppresses his potential because a competent Peter might leave her or challenge her control. Other characters in the show sometimes recognize that Lois has serious issues, but these observations get dismissed or ignored. Brian has pointed out that Lois is controlling and manipulative in several episodes. Quagmire has expressed that he sees through Lois's act and thinks she is cruel to Peter. Even Peter's father-in-law, Carter Pewterschmidt, treats Peter badly in part because he learned it from watching how Lois treats her husband. The show frames these observations as jokes or misunderstandings, but they acknowledge that people around the Griffins notice something wrong with how Lois behaves. The fact that these concerns never lead to consequences for Lois mirrors how real abuse often goes unaddressed because the abuser has successfully convinced everyone that the victim deserves the treatment they receive. Lois's relationship with Brian is telling because she treats him better than she treats Peter in many ways. She has intelligent conversations with Brian, respects his opinions, and shows him affection without constant criticism. This differential treatment proves Lois is capable of treating people well when she chooses to. She specifically chooses not to treat Peter well. The respect she shows Brian compared to the contempt she shows Peter reveals that Peter's treatment is deliberate rather than reactive. Lois could be kind to Peter but selects cruelty instead because cruelty serves her purposes better. The show has revealed that Lois has a specific fantasy about her ideal life that does not include the family she actually has. In episodes where she imagines alternate realities or expresses her true desires, she often envisions herself with different children, a different husband, or no family at all. She dreams of being a musician or artist, living a glamorous life, being free of responsibility. These fantasies suggest Lois deeply resents her actual family and sees them as obstacles to the life she wanted. This resentment drives her abusive behavior. She punishes Peter and her children for existing and preventing her from living her fantasy. They are anchors holding her down, and she makes sure they know it through her cruelty. Meg's role in the family as the designated target of abuse serves Lois's needs perfectly. By encouraging everyone to mistreat Meg, Lois creates a lightning rod that absorbs family dysfunction and prevents it from being directed at her. Meg takes the blame and abuse that might otherwise fall on Lois for being a bad mother and wife. The show even had Meg explicitly state that she accepts abuse to keep the family stable, which frames her suffering as necessary. This framing benefits Lois enormously. As long as Meg exists as the family scapegoat, Lois can abuse Peter without being seen as the problem. The family needs someone to blame and hurt, and Lois has ensured that person is Meg rather than herself. Lois's sexual control over Peter is another tool of abuse. She withholds sex as punishment and grants it as reward, using physical intimacy to manipulate Peter's behavior. She has explicitly stated that she uses sex to control him in several episodes. She also uses Peter's sexual desires to humiliate him, making him beg or degrade himself for her attention. This sexual manipulation keeps Peter desperate and willing to endure mistreatment in exchange for occasional affection. Lois understands that Peter's desire for her gives her power over him, and she exploits that power without guilt or hesitation. The show occasionally depicts Lois having mental health crises or breaking down, which the narrative frames as evidence that she is stressed and struggling. However, these breakdowns can also be read as moments when the energy required to maintain her controlling behavior becomes too much. Abusers often experience stress from managing their abuse and controlling their victims' behavior. When Lois breaks down, She is not collapsing under the weight of dealing with Peter's incompetence. She is exhausted from the effort of maintaining her dominance and managing the family dynamics she has created. Her breakdowns generate sympathy and reinforce the narrative that she is the victim of her family's dysfunction rather than its architect. Peter's relationship with alcohol takes on new meaning when viewed as a response to abuse. He drinks constantly throughout the series, spending hours at the Drunken Clam with his friends. This behavior looks like irresponsibility and neglect of his family, but it also represents Peter's only escape from Lois's control. The bar is the one place where he can exist without her supervision and criticism. His drinking likely numbs the emotional pain of living in an abusive marriage. Many people in abusive relationships turn to substances to cope with their situation, and Peter's alcoholism fits this pattern perfectly. Lois complains about his drinking but also benefits from it because intoxicated Peter is easier to control and more likely to make mistakes she can use against him. The cyclical nature of Peter and Lois's relationship matches abuse cycles. Peter does something Lois disapproves of. She punishes him through criticism or violence or withdrawal of affection. He apologizes and tries to make it up to her. She eventually forgives him, and there is a brief period of peace before the cycle starts again. This pattern repeats in episode after episode. Abuse relationships follow similar cycles where tension builds, abuse occurs, the abuser apologizes or the victim placates them. There's a honeymoon period, and then tension builds again. Peter and Lois never break this cycle because breaking it would require Lois to stop being abusive, and she has no reason to stop since the abuse serves her needs. The show has depicted alternate, universe versions of the Griffin family where Peter and Lois have different dynamics, and these versions often show Peter as more competent when not married to Lois. In timelines where they never married or where Lois is absent, Peter sometimes functions better and makes smarter decisions. This suggests that Peter's dysfunction is specifically tied to his relationship with Lois, rather than being his inherent nature. Remove Lois from the equation and Peter improves, which supports the theory that she is the source of his problems rather than the solution to them. Lois's need for control extends beyond Peter to the entire family. She decides what the children can do, who they can see, how they should behave. She monitors and controls every aspect of family life with an iron grip disguised as responsible parenting. Chris and Stewie show signs of being emotionally damaged by her treatment. Chris has developed strange behaviors and seems emotionally stunted. Stewie has murderous rage directed primarily at Lois, which Freudian psychology would interpret as the child recognizing the mother as a threat. Even as a baby, Stewie somehow understands that Lois is dangerous, and his plots to kill her represent a subconscious recognition of her abusive nature. The way the show frames Lois as sympathetic and reasonable while depicting Peter as the problem reflects how society often fails to recognize female abusers. Cultural narratives assume women are nurturing and men are aggressive, so when a woman abuses a man emotionally or physically, observers excuse or minimize it. Lois benefits from these assumptions. She appears to be the responsible adult managing a chaotic household, and everyone accepts this framing without examining her behavior critically. The show has built into its premise that Peter is the problem and Lois is the solution, but examining their actual interactions reveals the opposite. Peter is damaged and broken by someone who has spent years systematically destroying his self-worth and autonomy. In this interpretation, every episode of Family Guy shows an abusive relationship where the victim has been so thoroughly broken that he appears to be the source of dysfunction rather than its target. Lois maintains her position as the real villain by hiding behind societal expectations about gender roles and family dynamics. She has convinced Peter, their children, and everyone around them that she is the hero of the family story when she is actually the source of most of their dysfunction. The show continues because abusive relationships often continue for years or lifetimes. Peter cannot leave because Lois has destroyed his ability to imagine life without her. He stays and endures endless cycles of abuse because she has convinced him he deserves nothing better. The tragedy of Family Guy in this reading is watching a man who has been so completely controlled and broken that he has forgotten he ever had the option to be anything else. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the theory that Lois will eventually leave Peter. One of the most discussed theories about Family Guy's future argues that the show is building toward an inevitable ending where Lois finally leaves Peter permanently. According to this interpretation, the writers have been planting seeds throughout hundreds of episodes that demonstrate the Griffin marriage cannot sustain itself indefinitely. Each season pushes their relationship closer to a breaking point, and eventually that breaking point will arrive in a way that even Family Guy's reset button cannot undo. The theory suggests that every fight, every betrayal, Every moment of chaos Peter creates is accumulating weight that will eventually crush the marriage. When you examine the actual episodes and trace the pattern of their relationship over 20+ years, the evidence suggests Lois's departure is not a question of if, but when. The foundation of this theory rests on examining how Peter and Lois's relationship has evolved across the series. In early seasons, their conflicts were relatively minor and always resolved by the episode's end. Peter did something stupid, Lois got angry, they talked it out, and love prevailed. But as the show progressed, the severity of Peter's actions escalated dramatically. He is no longer just forgetting anniversaries or making minor mistakes. He has endangered Lois's life, destroyed her dreams, humiliated her publicly in increasingly extreme ways, and committed acts that would end any real marriage instantly. The show has raised the stakes of Peter's failure season after season, and there is only so far this escalation can go before something breaks permanently. Several episodes have already featured Peter and Lois separating or nearly divorcing, and each instance pushes them closer to a point of no return. In one storyline, they separate after a major fight, and both start dating other people. Lois experiences what life could be like without Peter, and seems genuinely happier during the separation. She enjoys the freedom, the lack of chaos, and the ability to make decisions without dealing with Peter's interference. They eventually reconcile, but the episode plants the seed that Lois has glimpsed an alternative life and found it appealing. Once someone in an unhappy marriage realizes they could be happy alone or with someone else, that knowledge never fully disappears. Lois now knows what leaving feels like, and every subsequent conflict makes that option more tempting. Another episode featured Lois having an affair or near affair that the show presented as understandable given how Peter treats her. While they stayed together, the episode acknowledged that Lois has legitimate reasons to want out of the marriage. The show gave her a sympathetic portrayal as someone trapped in a relationship with a man who takes her for granted and makes her life harder. This narrative framing is significant because it establishes that the audience would understand and potentially support Lois leaving. The writers are preparing viewers to accept that Lois deserves better than Peter, which sets up a future storyline where she finally acts on that realization. The pattern of reconciliation after each fight has become increasingly forced and hollow. In early seasons, Peter and Lois would have genuine emotional moments where they remembered why they love each other. In recent seasons, their reconciliations feel perfunctory and unearned. Peter apologizes with a grand gesture that fixes nothing about his fundamental behavior. Lois accepts because the episode needs to end, and they return to the status quo without addressing any real issues. This pattern cannot continue forever because it rings increasingly false. The show itself seems aware that these reconciliations are not sustainable, and eventually the narrative will need to reflect that reality by having Lois refuse to reconcile. Lois's character development over the series shows her growing more independent, more aware of her own needs, and less willing to sacrifice herself for Peter. Early Lois was more traditionally submissive and patient. Modern Lois has career ambitions, stands up for herself more forcefully, and regularly expresses frustration with her life. The show has developed her into someone who knows she deserves better, but has not yet found the strength to leave. This character arc logically concludes with her finally choosing herself over the marriage. Character development demands growth, and Lois's growth has been toward autonomy and self-respect. The natural endpoint of that growth is leaving a relationship that diminishes her. Peter has shown no capacity for genuine change throughout the entire series. This is crucial to understanding why divorce becomes inevitable. If Peter could learn and grow, the marriage might survive, but hundreds of episodes have proven he cannot or will not change his fundamental behavior. He makes the same mistakes repeatedly, apologizes, and then immediately does something equally destructive. Lois has given him infinite chances, and he has wasted every single one. At some point, even the most patient person runs out of chances to give. The show has established that Peter will never become the husband Lois needs him to be, which means staying married means accepting permanent unhappiness. Eventually, Lois will realize that leaving is the only way to have a different life. The show has introduced multiple episodes where Lois imagines life without Peter, or where she explicitly states she regrets marrying him. These moments are played for comedy but reveal her true feelings. She has verbalized that she gave up a better life to be with Peter, and that she questions whether the sacrifice was worth it. She has fantasized about being with other men or living alone. She has expressed that Peter holds her back from achieving her goals. When someone repeatedly voices regret about their marriage, they are usually working up the courage to end it. The show has given Lois numerous opportunities to express dissatisfaction with her marriage, which plants the idea in the audience's mind that she might act on those feelings eventually. Peter's chaos has escalated to levels that endanger the entire family's safety, finances, and future. He has bankrupted the family multiple times. He has put the children in mortal danger. He has made enemies who threaten the family with violence. He has destroyed their home, their possessions, and Lois's sense of security. In real life, any one of these incidents might trigger divorce, but Peter commits these offenses regularly. The accumulation of damage he causes cannot be waved away forever. At some point, Lois will recognize that staying with Peter means accepting that her children will never be safe, her finances will never be stable, and her life will never have peace. Maternal instinct and self-preservation will eventually override whatever love remains. The show has depicted Lois having serious conversations with friends, family, or therapists about her marriage, and these conversations increasingly acknowledge that her situation is not normal or acceptable. Other characters tell her she deserves better. They validate her feelings of frustration and exhaustion. They subtly or explicitly suggest she should leave. The show is surrounding Lois with voices that support the idea of divorce, which creates a permission structure for her to eventually take that step. If everyone around her agrees that leaving would be reasonable, she will find it easier to actually leave when the final straw arrives. Certain episodes have shown what Lois's life could look like after divorce, and those depictions are notably positive. In alternate timelines or fantasy sequences, divorced Lois is often happier, healthier, and more fulfilled than married Lois. She pursues her music career, she dates interesting men, she has freedom and peace. The show has provided glimpses of a post-Peter life that looks appealing rather than tragic. This narrative choice suggests the writers are preparing the audience to see divorce not as a sad ending, but as a positive new beginning for Lois. When the actual divorce happens, viewers will already have been shown that Lois will be okay and probably better off. The children's ages and development support the timeline for divorce. Meg is already a teenager, and Chris is approaching adulthood. Stewie remains a baby, but in terms of narrative timing, the children are old enough that divorce becomes more feasible. Lois does not need to stay for the children's sake as much as she might have when they were younger. Meg and Chris can handle their parents separating, and Stewie is too young to remember a time when they were together anyway. The practical obstacles to divorce are diminishing as the children grow, which means Lois has fewer reasons to stay in an unhappy marriage for their benefit. Peter has crossed lines in recent seasons that feel like they should be unforgivable. He has publicly humiliated Lois in ways that damaged her reputation and relationships. He has betrayed her trust in fundamental ways. He has shown shocking selfishness and disregard for her well-being. The show keeps raising the bar on how badly Peter can behave, and each new extreme should logically be the thing that finally ends the marriage. The fact that Lois keeps forgiving these escalating offenses cannot continue indefinitely without straining narrative credibility. Eventually, the writers will need to acknowledge that some actions cannot be forgiven, and Peter will cross that final line. The show's willingness to make permanent changes in recent years suggests divorce is not off the table. Brian died and stayed dead for multiple episodes before returning. Characters have been written out or significantly changed. The show has demonstrated it can commit to major narrative shifts rather than always reverting to the exact same status quo. This evolution in the show's structure makes permanent divorce more plausible than it would have been in earlier seasons when nothing ever changed. Family Guy has matured to the point where it might be willing to fundamentally alter its premise by ending the Griffin marriage. Lois has developed relationships and friendships outside of Peter that provide her with emotional support and alternative perspectives. She has friends who are not connected to Peter, activities she does alone, and an identity separate from being Peter's wife. This independence is significant because people in isolated relationships where they have no life outside their partner find it much harder to leave. Lois has built a support network and separate identity that would allow her to survive and thrive after divorce. The groundwork for her life after Peter already exists, which makes the actual leaving more feasible narratively. The show has featured episodes where Peter and Lois attend marriage counseling, and these sessions reveal fundamental incompatibilities that counseling cannot fix. The therapist sometimes looks horrified by what Peter has done or suggests that the marriage has serious problems. These episodes frame their relationship as broken, rather than just strained. Marriage counseling in fiction often serves as a precursor to divorce because it allows characters to officially acknowledge that the relationship is failing despite efforts to save it. Once counseling has been tried and failed, divorce becomes the logical next step. Peter's friendships at the Drunken Clam have increasingly become his primary emotional relationships, suggesting he has already partially checked out of his marriage. He spends more time with Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland than with his wife. He shares his thoughts and feelings with his friends rather than with Lois. He seems happier at the bar than at home. This emotional distance indicates that both Peter and Lois have been slowly separating emotionally, even while remaining legally married. They are already living somewhat separate lives within the same house. The emotional divorce has been happening gradually across seasons. and the legal divorce would simply formalize what has already occurred. Lois's parents, particularly her father Carter Schmidt, have always disapproved of Peter and have repeatedly offered Lois ways out of the marriage. Carter has enough money to support Lois through a divorce and provide her with financial security. He would celebrate her leaving Peter and probably help her with lawyers and resources. Having family support for divorce, especially from a wealthy and powerful father, removes one of the major obstacles people face when considering leaving a marriage. Lois knows she has somewhere to go and someone who will help her, which makes leaving less frightening. The show has paralleled Peter and Lois's marriage with other failing marriages in their social circle. Couples around them have divorced or have obviously miserable relationships. These comparisons invite Lois and the audience to wonder why the Griffin marriage persists when similar relationships have already ended. Seeing other couples divorce normalizes the idea and shows that life continues after marriage ends. The show is creating a context where divorce is common and survivable, which makes the Griffin divorce less shocking and more inevitable when it eventually happens. Recent episodes have shown Lois experiencing moments of clarity where she recognizes how dysfunctional her life has become. She has breakdowns where she admits she is unhappy, exhausted, and trapped. She has verbalized that she feels like she wasted her life on Peter. These moments of self-awareness are crucial because people cannot leave unhealthy situations until they fully acknowledge how unhealthy those situations are. Lois is reaching the point of clear-eyed understanding about her marriage, and once that understanding fully crystallizes, action will follow. The show's tone has gradually shifted to acknowledge darker truths about the Griffin family rather than just playing everything for laughs. Earlier seasons treated Peter's stupidity as harmless fun. Recent seasons show real consequences and real damage. The writers are willing to explore the painful realities of this family's dysfunction, which suggests they might be willing to take the ultimate step of showing the marriage ending. The tonal shift toward more serious consequences supports the theory that divorce could happen because the show is no longer afraid to acknowledge that actions have permanent effects. Lois has aged psychologically even though she has not aged physically. She shows signs of exhaustion, burnout, and emotional damage that have accumulated over years of dealing with Peter. She seems tired in a way that suggests she is running out of the energy required to maintain the marriage. People stay in difficult relationships as long as they have the emotional resources to cope, but those resources are not infinite. Lois appears to be approaching empty, and when she reaches that point, she will no longer have the strength to keep forgiving and forgetting. Exhaustion will make the decision for her. The narrative has established that Peter would survive divorce and possibly even benefit from it. He has friends, a job, and enough external support that he would not completely fall apart without Lois. The show has been careful not to make Lois so essential to Peter's basic functioning that leaving him would be equivalent to abandoning a helpless child. Peter is incompetent but not completely incapable. This narrative choice suggests the writers want the audience to feel okay about Lois leaving because Peter will be fine. He will be sad, he will struggle, but he will survive. This removes the guilt factor that might otherwise make Lois look like a villain for abandoning her husband. Certain recent episodes feel like they are testing how the audience would react to a separated or divorced Griffin family. Storylines where they live apart temporarily, or where the family dynamic shifts significantly, seem designed to gauge whether viewers would accept a permanent change. If the show's creators are considering divorce as a real possibility, they would want to experiment with it in temporary ways first to see if it breaks the show, or if the show functions fine with that change. These experimental episodes suggest the writers are at least exploring the idea seriously. The theory predicts that the actual divorce will be triggered by a single catastrophic event rather than gradual decline. Peter will do something so egregious, so unforgivable, so destructive that even his strongest defenders will acknowledge Lois has no choice but to leave. This event will be bigger than anything Peter has done before because it needs to justify breaking the pattern of forgiveness that has defined hundreds of episodes. Perhaps he endangers the children in a way that cannot be dismissed. Perhaps he destroys something truly irreplaceable to Lois. Perhaps he has an affair or commits a betrayal that Lois cannot rationalize away. Whatever the trigger event is, it will need to be significant enough that the audience understands this is different from all the previous times. After the divorce, the show could continue with a new dynamic. Peter could get visitation with the kids. Lois could explore life as a single mother. The family would still interact, just in a different configuration. The show's premise does not require Peter and Lois to be married, only that the Griffin family exists in some form. Divorce would provide fresh storylines, new conflicts, and character development that the current setup has exhausted. From a creative standpoint, the marriage has been strip-mined for material for over 20 years. Ending it would revitalize the show by forcing new situations and dynamics. The theory also suggests that if divorce happens, it will be presented as ultimately the right decision for both Peter and Lois. The show will frame it not as a tragedy, but as necessary growth. Lois will be happier and freer. Peter will be forced to grow up and become more independent. The children will adjust and possibly benefit from reduced chaos in their lives. The narrative will validate that staying together for the wrong reasons is worse than separating for the right ones. This framing would allow the show to handle divorce in a way that feels positive rather than depressing, while also delivering a surprisingly mature message about relationships. Looking at the canonical evidence across hundreds of episodes, the pattern is clear. Peter and Lois's marriage has been deteriorating slowly but surely. Each season brings new lows, new betrayals, new reasons to leave. Lois has been growing stronger and more independent, while Peter has remained stagnant. The show has been preparing the audience to accept divorce as inevitable and possibly positive. The groundwork has been laid across years of episodes, and eventually that groundwork will support the major narrative shift of ending the Griffin marriage. The question is not whether Lois will leave Peter, but when, and what final unforgivable act will be the catalyst. The marriage is on borrowed time, and both the characters and the show itself seem to know it. When the divorce finally happens, it will feel both shocking and completely expected because the show has been building toward it for years. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Next up, we have Brian Griffin. Brian was once a human. CIA brain swap. One of the most disturbing theories about Brian Griffin suggests he was not born as a talking dog, but was created through government experimentation that transplanted a human brain into a dog's body. According to this widely discussed interpretation, Brian's exceptional intelligence, human-level consciousness, and ability to function in human society are not natural traits but the result of CIA mind transfer experiments, similar to those referenced throughout the Family Guy and American Dad universes. The theory argues that Brian retains memories, personality, and consciousness from his human life while being trapped in a dog's body, which explains his constant existential crisis, his desperate need for validation, and his complicated relationship with his own identity. When you examine the canonical evidence across both shows and trace the hints dropped about Brian's mysterious origins, this theory finds substantial support in moments that reveal something profoundly wrong about what Brian actually is. The foundation of this theory rests on the undeniable fact that Brian is nothing like other dogs in the Family Guy universe. Most animals in the show behave like normal animals. They do not talk. They do not walk upright. They do not have human-level intelligence or consciousness. Yet Brian speaks fluent English, writes novels, attends college, drives cars, drinks martinis, and engages in romantic relationships with human women. The show never explains why Brian possesses these abilities when no other dog does. He is not presented as an evolutionary anomaly or a magical creature. He simply exists as an impossibility that everyone accepts without question. This acceptance itself is suspicious because it suggests something about Brian's nature that characters know but never discuss openly. If Brian's abilities came from government experimentation, it would explain both why he is unique and why nobody questions his existence. The American Dad connection provides crucial evidence for government experimentation on animals creating human-level intelligence. American Dad, created by Seth MacFarlane and existing in a shared universe with Family Guy, features Roger the Alien and has shown multiple CIA experiments involving consciousness transfer, memory manipulation, and creating hybrid beings. The CIA in this universe regularly performs unethical experiments that violate every scientific and moral boundary. They have the technology and complete lack of ethics required to transplant human consciousness into animal bodies. The shows have confirmed through crossover episodes and references that Family Guy and American Dad share the same reality, which means CIA capabilities shown in American Dad exist in Brian's world as well. If the CIA can do consciousness transfer in one show, they can do it in the other. Brian's mysterious origin story raises immediate red flags when examined closely. The show has revealed very little about Brian's early life before he met Peter. He talks about his mother and references a difficult puppyhood, but the details remain vague and contradictory. The show seems deliberately evasive about where Brian came from and how he became what he is. In one episode, Brian meets his mother, who is a normal dog without human intelligence or speech. She does not talk, she behaves like a regular animal, and she has no explanation for why her son is radically different from her. If Brian was born naturally to a normal dog mother, he should be a normal dog. His exceptional abilities make no genetic sense unless something happened to him after birth that fundamentally altered his nature. The theory suggests Brian was originally human, possibly someone who volunteered for or was coerced into a CIA experiment that promised consciousness transfer or life extension. The experiment involved transplanting his human brain or consciousness into a dog's body, perhaps as a test for extending human life by moving consciousness into younger, healthier bodies. Something went wrong, or perhaps the experiment worked exactly as intended, but was too controversial to continue, so Brian was abandoned or escaped. He ended up on the streets as a stray before Peter found him. Brian retained his human intelligence, personality, and memories, but found himself trapped in a dog's physical form. This would explain why he acts human despite being a dog. He is not a dog pretending to be human. He is literally human consciousness in a dog's body. Brian's existential crisis and depression throughout the series make far more sense in this context. He is constantly anxious, dissatisfied, and struggling with self-worth issues that go deeper than normal personality flaws. He drinks heavily, uses drugs, and shows signs of deep psychological trauma. He writes novels and pursues artistic recognition with desperate intensity, as if proving his humanity through creative work. He forms romantic relationships with human women and becomes devastated when these relationships fail. Not just heartbroken, but existentially crushed. These reactions suggest someone trying to reclaim or prove their human identity, rather than a dog who happens to be smart. If Brian was human before the experiment, his depression stems from being trapped in a form that prevents him from living as who he really is. He cannot fully integrate into human society because he is physically a dog, and he cannot accept being a dog because he is mentally human. The way other characters treat Brian oscillates between accepting him as human and reminding him he is a dog, which creates a cognitive dissonance that the theory explains perfectly. Sometimes, the Griffins treat Brian as a full family member who eats at the table and participates equally. Other times they remind him he is a dog by making him sleep on the floor, putting him on a leash, or telling him to remember his place. This inconsistent treatment would be psychologically devastating for someone who was once fully human. The family knows on some level that Brian is different from other dogs, possibly because Peter was told about Brian's origin when he adopted him, but they cannot fully reconcile treating a dog-shaped being as completely human. Their inconsistency reflects their confusion about what Brian actually is. Brian's relationship with Stewie becomes crucial evidence when viewed through this lens. Stewie is a genius who builds time machines, clones, and advanced technology that rivals or exceeds CIA capabilities. Stewie understands science and consciousness at levels that would allow him to detect if Brian's brain structure was artificially modified or transplanted. The fact that Stewie forms his closest bond with Brian, despite Brian being supposedly just a dog, suggests Stewie recognizes something extraordinary about Brian's consciousness. Stewie treats Brian as his intellectual equal and closest friend, which he would not do if Brian were simply a smart dog. Stewie may have analyzed Brian's brain and discovered the truth, but keeps it secret because revealing it would destroy Brian psychologically or put him in danger from whatever agency created him. Several episodes feature Brian having flashbacks or memories that seem inconsistent with having lived his entire life as a dog. He references experiences and knowledge that a dog should not possess, even a very intelligent one. He understands complex human social dynamics, historical events, and cultural references in ways that suggest lived experience rather than learned knowledge. Some of his memories, when described, sound like they could be from a human life that he either cannot fully access or has rationalized as somehow being part of his dog experience. The show never dwells on these inconsistencies, but they accumulate across episodes to suggest Brian's memories do not entirely match the life he claims to have lived. Brian's physical capabilities exceed what a dog's body should be able to do. He walks upright consistently, which is extremely difficult and unnatural for a dog's skeletal structure. He manipulates objects with paws that lack opposable thumbs, yet he types on computers, opens doors, and uses tools with human dexterity. His vocal cords produce perfect human speech, despite dogs lacking the physiological structures required for complex language. These impossible physical feats suggest his body has been modified beyond normal dog anatomy. A brain transplant experiment would likely include physical modifications to make the dog body capable of executing human intentions. The CIA would need to alter the vocal cords, adjust the spine and limbs for bipedal movement, and possibly modify the paws to allow object manipulation. Brian's body is not entirely dog anymore, but a hybrid creation designed to house human consciousness. The show has featured episodes where Brian's humanity is directly questioned or explored in ways that support the theory. In one episode, Brian tries to join the police force and faces discrimination for being a dog, despite being clearly more qualified than human applicants. The legal and social system cannot process what he is because he defies categorization. He is not human enough to have full human rights, but too human to be treated as a pet. This liminal status creates constant problems for him that the show plays for comedy, but that would be genuinely nightmarish for someone trapped between species. If Brian was human and knows it, this discrimination represents not just unfair treatment, but a systematic denial of his true identity. Another episode showed Brian having a near-death experience where he confronts mortality and questions his existence. His fear of death goes beyond normal survival instinct and touches on existential dread about what happens to a transplanted consciousness after the body dies. If Brian's consciousness was moved from a human body to a dog body, he faces the terrifying uncertainty of whether his consciousness is bound to the dog body now or whether death would finally free him. He might also fear that his original human body died years ago and he has been living in a borrowed form on extended time, making every day a reminder that he should already be dead. The show established that Brian ages in dog years, which creates a timeline problem that the theory helps solve. He has been with the Griffin family for what appears to be 15 to 20 years of showtime, which means he should be elderly or dead by dog aging standards. Yet Brian remains relatively young and healthy. If his consciousness is human and his body has been artificially modified, his aging might be slowed or altered by the same technology that made his existence possible. The CIA would want to extend the lifespan of experimental subjects to gather long-term data, so they might have included life extension modifications in the procedure. Brian's aging inconsistency suggests his body does not follow normal biological rules because it is an engineered hybrid rather than a natural dog. Brian's sexual attraction to human women is presented as a running joke in the show, but it becomes disturbing evidence when considering this theory. Dogs do not feel sexual attraction to humans because they are different species. Brian consistently pursues, dates, and has sexual relationships with human women, and these relationships are depicted as genuine attractions rather than aberrant behavior. If Brian retains human sexual attraction and human consciousness, his pursuit of human women makes perfect sense. He is attracted to humans because he is mentally human, regardless of his physical form. The fact that some women reciprocate his interest suggests they recognize something human in him that transcends his dog appearance. This would not happen if he were actually a dog, no matter how intelligent. The theory explains why Brian is so invested in human political and social issues. He reads newspapers obsessively, follows politics closely, and has strong opinions about human society and culture. A naturally evolved intelligent dog would likely develop a unique perspective separate from human concerns, but Brian's worldview is entirely human. He cares about human problems because they are his problems. He was part of human society before the experiment, and he desperately wants to remain connected to that world despite his transformation. His political activism and intellectual pursuits are attempts to maintain his human identity and prove he still belongs in human society, despite his form. Several characters throughout the series have reacted to Brian with shock or confusion when first meeting him, suggesting they initially perceive something deeply wrong about him before accepting his existence. These reactions happen less as the show progresses because characters who know Brian grow accustomed to him, but new characters sometimes show visible disturbance before adjusting. This pattern suggests people instinctively recognize that Brian is an anomaly, something that should not exist, before social pressure and Brian's own behavior convince them to ignore their instincts. If Brian is the product of illegal experimentation, people might sense something unnatural about him without being able to articulate what specifically is wrong. The show has referenced government conspiracies, cover-ups, and experiments in numerous episodes across both Family Guy and American Dad. These references establish that the universe contains secret government programs performing horrific experiments without public knowledge or consent. The CIA has been shown doing mind control, creating super soldiers, developing biological weapons, and conducting human experimentation. Consciousness transfer fits perfectly within the established range of unethical projects these agencies pursue. The fact that the shows keep returning to government experimentation themes suggests the writers are building a consistent universe where such projects exist and have real consequences. Brian's name is notably human rather than a typical dog name like Spot or Rex. Most people give their pets simple, cute names, but Brian has a formal human name that suggests identity rather than ownership. If Peter adopted Brian knowing he was a human consciousness in a dog body, he might have asked Brian what his name was rather than imposing a pet name on him. Brian could be his actual human name from before the experiment, or it could be a name he chose to maintain his human identity. Either way, the name signals that Brian's identity is self-determined rather than assigned by an owner. The theory also explains Brian's complicated relationship with his dog nature. He sometimes performs dog behaviors like sniffing or chasing tennis balls, but he immediately shows shame or confusion about these impulses. If human consciousness was transplanted into a dog brain, some dog instincts might remain in the brain tissue itself or in the body's autonomic responses. Brian would experience confusing moments where dog instincts override his human consciousness, leading to behavior that feels alien to his sense of self. His shame about these moments stems from them reminding him that he is trapped in a dog's body with dog biology affecting his supposedly human consciousness. Episodes where Brian experiences memory loss or altered consciousness reveal inconsistencies that support the transplant theory. When his memories are affected, sometimes dog-like behaviors emerge more strongly, as if removing his human consciousness exposes the dog brain underneath. Other times, his personality fragments in ways that suggest multiple consciousness layers rather than a unified identity. These episodes hint that Brian's consciousness is not naturally integrated with his physical form, but exists as an overlay or transplant that can be disrupted. The show has never revealed who Brian's father is or provided information about his breeding, which is suspicious for someone the Griffins have known for years. If Brian were a normal dog with an unusual mutation, his genetics would be fascinating and worth exploring. The complete lack investigation into his origins suggests that the truth is either deliberately hidden or too dangerous to pursue. Peter might have agreed never to ask questions about where Brian came from as a condition of adopting him. Government agencies that create illegal experimental subjects would want those subjects' origins to remain secret, and they might monitor Brian to ensure he never reveals the truth about what he is. Brian's success as a writer becomes more plausible if he was originally an educated human with writing experience. His novels and scripts show genuine literary ambition and skill that would be nearly impossible for even the most intelligent dog to develop. Writing requires not just intelligence, but years of education, cultural knowledge, and practice. If Brian was a writer or intellectual before the experiment, he would possess all the background knowledge required to write novels. His struggle to achieve recognition stems not from lack of talent, but from the impossibility of being taken seriously as a dog author. Publishers and critics cannot reconcile the quality of his work with his physical form, so they dismiss him despite his genuine abilities. The timing of when Peter found Brian also raises questions. Peter found Brian as a stray on the street at a convenient moment when the Griffin family needed a pet. The show has never explained why Brian was on the street or how he ended up there. If Brian was an escaped or abandoned government experiment, he would have been living as a stray while trying to survive in a form that made integration into society nearly impossible. Peter finding him might not have been coincidence, but rather the result of the agency that created Brian, allowing him to be adopted by a normal family as part of long-term observation. The Griffins could be unknowingly monitored to see how a transplanted consciousness adapts to domestic life over years. Brian's alcoholism takes on darker meaning as a coping mechanism for the psychological horror of his situation. He drinks constantly throughout the series, far more than addiction alone would explain. If he knows he was human and is now trapped as a dog, alcohol becomes his only escape from that unbearable reality. He cannot seek therapy because explaining his true situation would sound insane. He cannot form genuine, intimate relationships because his physical form prevents true acceptance. He cannot reclaim his human life because that person officially died or disappeared when the experiment occurred. Drinking numbs the constant awareness that he is living a nightmare with no possibility of waking up. The theory suggests that somewhere in the Family Guy universe, files exist documenting Brian's creation. The CIA or whatever agency performed the experiment would have kept records of their subjects, including Brian's original human identity, the circumstances of the transplant, and monitoring data from his years with the Griffin family. These files, if revealed, would answer every question about Brian's origin and prove that he is not a natural occurrence but a created being. The show could eventually use these files as a plot device to explore Brian's past and confront him with the truth he either knows and represses or genuinely does not remember. Looking at the canonical evidence, Brian exhibits every characteristic of human consciousness trapped in a non-human form. His intelligence, behavior, desires, knowledge, and psychological profile all point towards someone who was human and retains that identity despite physical transformation. The existence of government programs capable of consciousness transfer is established in the shared universe. Brian's origin remains deliberately mysterious despite years of storytelling. His aging does not follow normal dog patterns. His relationships, ambitions, and struggles make sense for a human, but not for a dog. The pieces fit together to suggest that Brian Griffin is not really a dog at all, but a human victim of experimental science, who continues living as an impossible hybrid, forever trapped between two species and fully belonging to neither. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the theory that Brian is actually the one writing Family Guy. One of the most mind-bending theories about Family Guy suggests that the entire show is actually a novel or screenplay written by Brian Griffin, and everything we watch is filtered through his perspective as the author. According to this interpretation, Brian is not just a character in Family Guy, but the creator of the story itself, and the show's bizarre structure, inconsistent logic, and self-aware humor all reflect the chaotic process of Brian writing and rewriting his magnum opus. The theory argues that Brian has been documenting his life with the Griffin family as a semi-autobiographical work, which explains why he appears as such a central and sympathetic figure despite being a dog, why the show constantly breaks its own reality, and why everything resets between episodes. When you examine the canonical evidence of Brian's writing career, his creative struggles, and how the show functions narratively, this meta-theory finds substantial support in moments that suggest someone is actively constructing this reality rather than simply living in it. The foundation of this theory rests on the undeniable fact that Brian is a writer who constantly works on novels, screenplays, and other creative projects throughout the series. Writing is not a hobby for Brian, but his primary identity and life purpose. He introduces himself as a writer before mentioning any other aspect of who he is. He spends countless episodes working on manuscripts, pitching ideas, and desperately seeking publication. The show has established that Brian pours his life experiences into his writing and uses his work as a way to process his existence. If Brian writes about his life obsessively, it makes perfect sense that Family Guy itself could be his most ambitious work, a sprawling narrative about the Griffin family that he continues writing episode after episode, year after year. The show's format perfectly mirrors how a struggling writer would construct a long-form narrative. Each episode functions as a chapter or standalone story within a larger work. Some episodes connect to ongoing storylines while others exist independently. The quality varies wildly from episode to episode, with some being brilliantly crafted and others feeling rushed or poorly conceived. This inconsistency matches exactly what you would expect from a writer producing hundreds of chapters over decades. Brian has good writing days and bad writing days. Sometimes he is inspired and creates something special. Other times he is blocked or lazy and produces filler content just to meet his self-imposed deadline of continuing the story. The show's uneven quality is not a bug, but a feature that reveals the writer behind it struggling with his craft. Brian's own novels and scripts within the show provide crucial evidence for how he approaches storytelling. When Brian writes, he always includes himself as a character, usually as the hero or the most intelligent person in the story. His work is semi-autobiographical to the point of narcissism. He creates transparent self-inserts and gives himself dialogue that makes him look smart, cultured, and morally superior. Family Guy follows this exact pattern with Brian as a character. Despite being a dog, Brian is portrayed as one of the smartest characters in the show, the voice of reason, and the moral center. He gets storylines where he is sexually desirable to human women, intellectually respected, and artistically talented. These characterizations make no sense from an objective perspective, but make perfect sense if Brian is writing himself into the story. He gives himself the role he wishes he had in real life because he controls the narrative. The show's political and social commentary aligns perfectly with Brian's established worldview. Family Guy takes clear positions on politics, religion, and social issues that match Brian's liberal ideology. The show mocks conservatives, organized religion, and traditional values while defending progressive causes and secular humanism. This is not subtle. The show's political stance is Brian's political stance because Brian is writing the show and cannot help but inject his opinions into every episode. When other characters express conservative views, they are usually portrayed as stupid or wrong, which reflects Brian's bias as the author. He creates straw-man arguments against his own beliefs and then has himself or like-minded characters easily defeat them. The show's politics are not objective satire, but Brian's personal political diary where he gets to win every argument. The cutaway gags that define Family Guy's comedy style make perfect sense as Brian's writing technique. When telling a story, Brian's mind wanders and he includes tangential references, memories, and jokes that have nothing to do with the main narrative. These cutaways represent Brian's actual thought process as he writes. He starts describing a scene, then remembers something funny from history or pop culture, so he includes it as a cutaway before returning to the main story. The cutaways are not part of the Griffin family's reality, but part of Brian's narrative construction. He is actively building the story in real time, getting distracted, adding jokes, and then continuing. The fact that cutaways happen mid-conversation and other characters do not acknowledge them makes sense because they exist on the meta level of Brian writing the story rather than on the level of the characters living it. Peter's characterization as increasingly stupid and chaotic over the series reflects Brian's growing resentment and frustration with him. In Brian's early writing, Peter was dumb but lovable. As their relationship deteriorated in real life, Brian began writing Peter as more obnoxious, more destructive, and more irredeemable. The degradation of Peter's character is not bad writing, but intentional character assassination by Brian. He uses his narrative power to punish Peter for whatever slights and frustrations occurred in their actual friendship. Every episode where Peter does something horrible to Brian is Brian processing real conflicts through fiction. Every time Peter is portrayed as a monster, Brian is venting his genuine anger through the safety of storytelling. The show has become Brian's therapy and his revenge simultaneously. Lois's characterization also reveals Brian's complex feelings about her. In many episodes, Lois is portrayed as the reasonable adult trying to manage chaos, which reflects Brian's respect for her. But in other episodes, Lois is shown as sexually promiscuous, manipulative, or cruel, which reflects Brian's resentment about her being married to Peter instead of being available to him. Brian has been attracted to Lois throughout the series, and this attraction colors how he writes her. She is both idealized and degraded depending on Brian's mood and his current feelings about his unrequited attraction. When Brian feels rejected by Lois, he writes episodes where she is flawed or makes terrible decisions. When he feels warmly toward her, he writes her as sympathetic and admirable. Her inconsistent characterization reflects Brian's inconsistent feelings about her. Stewie receives special treatment in Brian's narrative because Stewie is Brian's best friend in real life. The show gives Stewie and Brian extensive storylines together, deep conversations, and a genuine emotional bond that surpasses other relationships in the show. Brian writes Stewie as a genius because he genuinely admires Stewie's intelligence. He writes their friendship as the emotional core of the show because it is the emotional core of Brian's actual life. The road trip episodes and time travel adventures featuring Brian and Stewie are Brian's way of documenting and celebrating their friendship. He creates scenarios where they can have meaningful conversations and share experiences because these moments matter to him personally. Stewie is the only character Brian consistently writes with depth and affection because Stewie is the only person Brian truly respects and loves. Meg's treatment in the show becomes darkly revealing in this context. Brian participates in abusing Meg, despite positioning himself as the moral character. If Brian is writing the show, he is making a deliberate choice to have Meg serve as the family punching bag. This could reflect Brian's genuine cruelty, or it could reflect his discomfort with Meg's real-life attraction to him. Several episodes have shown Meg having romantic or sexual interest in Brian, and he finds this attention disturbing. By writing Meg as pathetic and undesirable, Brian ensures that any attraction between them is portrayed as inappropriate and one-sided. He uses the narrative to create distance between himself and Meg, while also working through his guilt about rejecting her by giving her occasional episodes where she stands up for herself or receives validation. The show's constant fourth wall breaking and self-awareness make perfect sense if Brian is actively writing it. Characters reference being in a television show, acknowledge the audience, and comment on the show's structure and format. These moments are Brian stepping outside his narrative to acknowledge his role as author. When characters break the fourth wall, Brian is breaking his own fictional construct to remind himself and the audience that this is a created work. He cannot maintain the illusion consistently because he is too self-conscious about the act of creation. Every meta joke is Brian winking at himself about what he is doing. He is simultaneously creating the story and commenting on his process of creating it. Episodes about Brian's writing process mirror the actual structure and problems of Family Guy itself. When Brian writes a novel or screenplay within the show, he faces criticism that his work is derivative, poorly structured, self-indulgent, and tries too hard to be edgy. These criticisms apply directly to Family Guy as a show. If Brian is writing Family Guy, these self-critical episodes are Brian processing real criticism he has received about his work. He includes characters telling him his writing is bad because part of him knows it is bad, but he continues anyway because writing is all he has. The show becomes increasingly self-aware about its flaws over time, which matches Brian becoming more aware of his limitations as a writer while being unable to stop writing. The show's treatment of death and consequences supports the theory that Brian controls the narrative. Characters die and come back because Brian changes his mind about killing them off. Locations appear and disappear because Brian forgets what he established previously or decides to retcon his own continuity. The timeline makes no sense because Brian is bad at tracking chronology in his long-term narrative. Everything that seems like sloppy writing in Family Guy becomes intentional characterization of Brian as a sloppy writer. The show's flaws are Brian's flaws as an author, and recognizing this reframes every inconsistency as evidence of the theory rather than evidence against it. Brian's death and resurrection arc becomes the most significant evidence for this theory. When Brian died after being hit by a car, the show continued for several episodes without him, before Stewie used time travel to prevent his death. In the meta-interpretation, Brian wrote himself dying as a way of exploring what the show would be like without him, and what his legacy would be. He needed to know if he mattered, so he removed himself from the narrative temporarily. The overwhelming grief the Griffin family expressed, especially Stewie, was Brian writing the reaction he hopes people would have if he died. He brought himself back because he could not commit to ending his own story, and because the narrative did not work without him as the author. Brian's death arc was him experimenting with mortality through fiction, and ultimately deciding he was not ready to end his chronicle. The show's liberal use of celebrity cameos and pop culture references reflects Brian's desperation to seem current and culturally relevant. Brian is obsessed with being seen as intelligent and sophisticated, so he fills his narrative with references that demonstrate his knowledge of movies, music, politics, and literature. The cutaway gags often feature historical figures or celebrities because Brian wants to show off everything he knows. He includes these references compulsively, even when they do not serve the story because they serve his need for validation. Every pop culture reference is Brian shouting, "I know about this thing," to an audience he hopes will be impressed. The show's increasing darkness and willingness to explore disturbing topics reflects Brian's growing cynicism and depression. Early Family Guy had relatively innocent humor with a family sitcom structure. Later seasons include jokes about death, violence, sexual assault, and other dark topics that push boundaries aggressively. This tonal shift matches Brian's personal decline throughout the series. As he becomes more alcoholic, more depressed, and more disillusioned with his life, the show he writes becomes darker and more nihilistic. His mental state bleeds into his creative work until the comedy becomes tinged with genuine bitterness and pain. The show gets meaner because Brian is getting meaner, both to others and to himself. Episodes that focus on Brian's failures as a writer take on new meaning if he is writing the show itself. When Brian's novel is rejected or his screenplay is criticized, he is processing real rejection of Family Guy by critics or audiences. He writes himself failing as a way of acknowledging that his work does not receive the respect he believes it deserves. But he also writes himself persevering and continuing to write despite failure, which is exactly what Brian does with Family Guy. The show continues for hundreds of episodes regardless of critical reception, because Brian refuses to stop writing. His fictional struggles mirror his real struggles with the actual narrative he produces. The show's ensemble cast structure supports the theory because it reflects Brian trying to write objectively about other people while inevitably centering himself. Brian attempts to give other characters their own storylines and development, but the narrative constantly returns to him. Episodes that supposedly focus on Peter or Lois often include significant Brian subplots. Brian appears in nearly every episode, even when his presence is not necessary to the plot. This happens because Brian is writing from his own perspective and cannot fully escape his subjectivity. He tries to create a balanced ensemble show but keeps inserting himself because he cannot imagine a world where he is not present and important. The show's sexual content and Brian's relationships with women reveal his wish fulfillment through writing. Brian dates attractive women who find him desirable despite him being a dog, which makes no logical sense but makes perfect sense as fantasy. If Brian is writing the show, he gives himself romantic and sexual success he likely does not have in reality. He creates women who see past his physical form and appreciate his intelligence and sensitivity. These relationships always fail, which could reflect either Brian's actual failed relationships or his inability to imagine himself in a successful long-term relationship because his self-loathing runs too deep. The pattern of Brian dating women above his league and then losing them is Brian working through his romantic failures within his fiction. Quagmire's famous speech about why he hates Brian becomes meta-commentary on Brian as a writer. Quagmire lists Brian's flaws in detail: his pretentiousness, his lecturing, his hypocrisy, his narcissism, his lack of self-awareness. If Brian wrote this speech, he is engaging in brutal self-criticism by having another character articulate everything wrong with him. Writers often process their insecurities by having characters voice their worst fears about themselves. Brian includes this devastating takedown in his own narrative because part of him knows Quagmire is right. He is everything Quagmire accuses him of being, and writing that speech is Brian's way of acknowledging his flaws while also continuing to be exactly who he is because he cannot change. The show's production quality and animation style remain consistent over decades, while the real world changes around it. If Brian is writing this story, the consistent visual style represents his imagination. He pictures events in a specific artistic style, and that style remains stable because it exists in his mind rather than being produced by an actual animation studio. The show's occasional experiments with different animation styles or live-action elements represent Brian trying new creative techniques in his writing. When Family Guy does a Star Wars parody or adopts a different visual approach, Brian is challenging himself creatively and trying to expand his abilities as a storyteller. The theory explains why the show can continue indefinitely without the characters aging or the premise fundamentally changing. Brian is not documenting events as they happen, but creating an ongoing fictional narrative based loosely on his life. He keeps the characters frozen at specific ages because that is when he started writing about them, and he does not want to deal with the complications of aging them. The floating timeline where modern technology appears but characters stay the same age is a feature of Brian's writing rather than a bug. He updates cultural references and current events in his narrative, while keeping the character dynamic stable because that is easier than writing characters who actually grow and change. Brian's alcoholism is both a plot point in the show and likely a factor in the show's creation. If Brian writes Family Guy while drinking, his intoxication would explain the show's chaotic structure, random digressions, and occasional lapses in logic or taste. Some episodes feel drunk because Brian was drunk when he wrote them. The cutaways become more random and the humor gets darker as episodes progress, mirroring how Brian's inhibitions dissolve as he drinks while writing. The show is the product of thousands of hours of Brian sitting at his computer with a glass of wine, typing out his interpretation of his life and his fantasies about what that life could be. Episodes where alternate versions of events are shown or where the show restarts from different premises represent Brian revising his work. Writers constantly reconsider their choices and imagine how the story would be different with alternative decisions. Brian includes these alternate timelines in his narrative because he cannot stop himself from exploring every possibility. He writes a version where something happens, then immediately writes another version where it happens differently, and includes both in his expansive chronicle because he cannot commit to a single definitive version of events. The show's contradictions and retcons are Brian's editing process made visible. The show's relationship with Fox Network and censorship can be read as Brian's relationship with publishers and editors. Family Guy pushes boundaries and includes controversial content that supposedly risks cancellation, which mirrors how Brian's work is supposedly too edgy and intellectual for mainstream acceptance. When the show references its own cancellation and return, Brian is writing about his manuscript being rejected and then accepted for publication. The network becomes a character in Brian's meta-narrative about the struggle to get his work seen and appreciated by audiences who he believes may not be sophisticated enough to understand it. Looking at hundreds of episodes through this lens, Family Guy exhibits every characteristic of being Brian's semi-autobiographical novel. The show centers Brian despite him being a dog because he is the author. It reflects his political views, his writing style, his psychological issues, and his creative limitations. It breaks its own reality constantly because Brian is self-conscious about the act of creation. It includes devastating criticism of Brian because he is aware of his flaws. It continues indefinitely because Brian cannot stop writing about himself and the family he lives with. The show's existence makes more sense as Brian's massive creative project than as an objective documentary of the Griffin family's adventures. Family Guy is not what happens to these characters. Family Guy is what Brian writes about what happens to these characters, filtered through his perspective, limited by his abilities, and shaped by his desperate need to create something meaningful that will outlive him and prove his intelligence and worth. The show is Brian's legacy, his therapy, his revenge, his fantasy, and his prison, all bound together in an endless narrative he can neither perfect nor abandon. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Next up, we got Meg Griffin is Stewie's biological mother. One of the most disturbing and widely discussed theories about Family Guy suggests that Stewie is not actually Lois and Peter's third child, but is instead Meg's biological son from a teenage pregnancy that the family covered up to avoid scandal. According to this interpretation, Lois and Peter agreed to raise Stewie as their own child, while Meg was forced to give up her baby and pretend to be his sister rather than his mother. The theory argues that the family's extreme mistreatment of Meg stems from resentment about the situation, that various jokes throughout the series serve as hints about the truth, and that the age gaps and relationship dynamics in the Griffin family only make sense if Stewie is actually Meg's child. When you examine the canonical evidence, including throwaway jokes, character ages, family dynamics, and specific episodes that hint at dark secrets, this theory finds disturbing support in moments that suggest something fundamentally wrong about Stewie's place in the family structure. The foundation of this theory rests on examining the actual ages and timeline of the Griffin children. Meg is 17 years old throughout most of the series. Chris appears to be around 13 or 14. Stewie is roughly 1 year old despite the show running for over 20 years. If we assume the characters were their current ages when the show began in 1999, Meg would have been around 16 or 17 at that time. This means Stewie was born when Meg was approximately 15 or 16 years old, which is exactly the age when a teenage pregnancy would occur. The spacing between Meg and Chris makes sense for planned children, but the gap between Chris and Stewie is much larger than between Meg and Chris. This unusual spacing could indicate that Stewie was not a planned pregnancy, but rather an unexpected situation that occurred years after Lois and Peter thought they were done having children. Or it could indicate that Stewie is not Lois's biological child at all. The way the family treats Meg compared to how they treat the other children reveals a disturbing pattern that this theory explains. Peter openly states he does not love Meg and treats her with contempt and cruelty. Lois participates in Meg's abuse and sometimes seems to resent her daughter's existence. Chris and Stewie both join in mocking and dismissing Meg. The entire family has designated Meg as the scapegoat who absorbs all blame and abuse. This treatment goes far beyond normal sibling rivalry or sitcom family dynamics. It resembles genuine hatred and resentment. If Meg had a baby as a teenager that disrupted the family and forced Lois and Peter to raise an additional child they did not want, their resentment would make sense. They blame Meg for the chaos, expense, and social embarrassment of the situation, so they punish her through constant emotional abuse. Meg is not hated because she is inherently worthless, but because she committed an unforgivable act that the family cannot openly acknowledge. Lois's age and circumstances when Stewie was born raise red flags when examined closely. Lois would have been in her late 30s or early 40s when Stewie was born, if he is her biological child. While women can certainly have children at that age, it becomes less common and more difficult. The show has never explained why Lois and Peter decided to have another child so many years after Chris. They never discuss planning for Stewie or wanting another baby. He simply exists without any backstory about his conception or birth. This absence of explanation is suspicious. If Stewie were Meg's child, Lois and Peter would not talk about planning for him because he was not planned. They took over raising him to protect Meg and maintain the family's reputation, but they never wanted him themselves. Several episodes have included jokes about Meg's sexual history or past relationships that could be hints about a teenage pregnancy. The show has made references to Meg having been sexually active at a young age or having experiences that damaged her psychologically. While these jokes are often just crude humor, they could also be the show's way of acknowledging that something significant happened in Meg's past involving sex and consequences. Family Guy frequently hides dark truths and throwaway jokes that seem meaningless until you realize they are consistent hints about deeper storylines. The repeated jokes about Meg's sexual past could be breadcrumbs leading to the revelation that she had a baby as a teenager. Stewie and Meg's relationship is notably different from typical sibling dynamics in ways that support this theory. Stewie is cruel to Meg like the rest of the family, but there are occasional moments of tenderness or connection between them that seem out of place. A few episodes have shown Meg protecting Stewie or showing maternal concern for him that goes beyond typical sibling care. When Stewie is in danger, Meg sometimes reacts with intensity that suggests deeper attachment than a sister would feel. These moments are rare because the show mostly maintains the fiction that Meg is just Stewie's sister, but they appear often enough to suggest an underlying bond that the narrative cannot completely suppress. If Meg is Stewie's biological mother, she would naturally feel protective and loving toward him, even while being forced to maintain distance and pretend he is her brother. The show has established that the Griffin family keeps massive secrets and engages in cover-ups regularly. Multiple episodes have revealed that Lois has a criminal past, that Peter's father was not his biological father, that various family members have hidden identities or secret histories. The family is demonstrably capable of maintaining elaborate lies over long periods of time. If Lois and Peter decided to raise Meg's baby as their own, they would absolutely be capable of maintaining that fiction indefinitely. The family's willingness to lie about fundamental aspects of their history is canonical and well established. A cover-up about Stewie's parentage fits perfectly within the family's existing pattern of deception. Brian's role in the family becomes significant in this theory because he would almost certainly know the truth. Brian has been with the family since before Stewie was born, and he is portrayed as Lois's confidant and closest friend besides Peter. If Meg had a teenage pregnancy, Lois would likely have discussed the situation with Brian and possibly relied on him for emotional support during the crisis. Brian's complicated relationship with the family's secrets and his tendency to drink heavily could be partially explained by guilt about participating in this cover-up. He knows Stewie is Meg's son, he knows the family's treatment of Meg is connected to the secret, and he says nothing because revealing the truth would destroy multiple lives. His alcoholism could be partly about numbing the guilt of watching Meg suffer for a mistake she made as a child while being denied her own baby. The show has made specific jokes that directly reference the possibility of Stewie being Meg's child. In at least one episode, a character makes a comment about Stewie possibly being Meg's baby, and the joke is dismissed or moved past quickly. Family Guy often uses this technique of stating something true as a joke and then moving on as if it was just random humor. The show has a history of hiding major reveals in plain sight by framing them as absurd jokes that audiences dismiss. When a show repeatedly makes the same joke about a character relationship, it often signals that the joke is actually truth disguised as humor. The fact that the show has explicitly referenced this theory within episodes suggests the writers are aware of it and may be intentionally planting evidence. Meg's depression, anxiety, and desperate need for acceptance make more sense in the context of having given up a child. Teenage mothers who give up their babies for adoption or who are forced to pretend their child is their sibling often suffer severe psychological consequences, including depression, identity confusion, and difficulty forming relationships. Meg exhibits all of these symptoms throughout the series. She is desperately lonely, struggles to connect with peers, has extremely low self-esteem, and seems psychologically damaged in ways that go beyond normal teenage angst. If she gave birth to Stewie and then had to watch Lois raise him as her own, while being forbidden from claiming him as her son, that trauma would explain her psychological state perfectly. She lives in the same house as her biological child, but cannot acknowledge their true relationship, which would be absolutely devastating. The theory explains why Meg stays with the family despite the abuse. Teenagers who are abused often leave home as soon as possible, but Meg stays despite having every reason to escape. If Stewie is her son, she cannot leave because leaving would mean abandoning her child. She endures the family's cruelty because staying close to Stewie is more important than her own well-being. Her inability to leave a toxic environment makes sense if she is motivated by maternal love for a child she gave up but still wants to be near. The few times Meg has tried to leave, she always comes back, which could indicate that her attachment to Stewie keeps pulling her home. Lois's complex feelings towards Stewie could reflect resentment about raising her daughter's child, rather than genuine maternal love. The show depicts Lois as sometimes affectionate towards Stewie but often frustrated by him, or seeming to barely tolerate his presence. She does not show the same instinctive maternal warmth towards Stewie that mothers typically show toward their babies. Her emotional distance makes sense if Stewie represents a burden she took on reluctantly to save her daughter's reputation. She loves him because she committed to raising him, but she also resents him because he was not her choice, and his existence constantly reminds her of Meg's mistake and the family's secret they maintain. Peter's complete disinterest in Stewie as a baby could indicate he knows Stewie is not his biological child. Peter largely ignores Stewie throughout the series and shows little paternal instinct toward him. He treats Stewie more like a strange roommate than his son. This emotional distance could reflect Peter's knowledge that Stewie is actually his grandson rather than his son. Peter agreed to the cover-up to protect Meg and maintain the family's reputation, but he cannot force himself to feel fatherly love for a child he knows is not really his. His indifference toward Stewie mirrors his hatred toward Meg because both emotions stem from the same source: resentment about the situation Meg created. The identity of Stewie's biological father becomes a crucial question if this theory is true. Meg would have been impregnated by someone when she was 15 or 16 years old. The show has never revealed who Meg dated during that time period, or mentioned any significant relationships from her early teenage years. This absence of information is suspicious. If Meg had a normal dating history, the show would reference it, but instead her romantic past before the show's current timeline is blank. This blank space could be where the pregnancy occurred. The father could have been another teenager, an older boy who took advantage of her, or even someone who assaulted her. The show's silence about this period of Meg's life suggests something happened that the family does not discuss. Stewie's genius-level intelligence and advanced capabilities could be explained through genetics if his father was exceptionally intelligent. If Meg became pregnant by someone unusually smart, possibly an older student or adult, Stewie's extraordinary abilities would come from his father's genetics, rather than being unexplained anomalies. This would ground Stewie's character in biological reality rather than leaving his intelligence as impossible cartoon logic. The show could reveal that Stewie's father was a prodigy or genius who Meg had a relationship with before the family shut down all discussion of that time period. The show has depicted Stewie having Oedipal fixations and murderous intentions toward Lois, which reads differently if Lois is not his biological mother. Stewie's desire to kill Lois could stem from subconscious knowledge that she is not really his mother. Children sometimes sense when family relationships are not what they are told, and Stewie's hostility toward Lois could indicate he instinctively knows something is wrong about their relationship. His elaborate plans to murder her represent his subconscious rage about being separated from his real mother and forced into a family structure based on lies. Meanwhile, Stewie never expresses desire to harm Meg, which could indicate he subconsciously recognizes her as his actual mother and therefore cannot direct violence toward her. Certain episodes have focused on family secrets, DNA tests, or revelations about true parentage in ways that could be setting up this reveal. The show has established that Griffin family members are not always biologically related to who they think they are related to. Peter discovered his real father was not Francis Griffin, but another man. The show demonstrated it is willing to completely rewrite family relationships through shocking revelations. If the show can reveal Peter's father is not his real father, it can reveal Stewie's mother is not his real mother. The precedent exists for this type of massive family secret. Meg's occasional moments of standing up for herself often center on her declaring that the family needs her more than they admit. In one significant episode, Meg explains that she accepts the family's abuse because someone needs to be the target, and if she were not there, the family would turn on each other. This speech reveals Meg understands her role in maintaining family stability. If she is Stewie's mother, her acceptance of abuse could also reflect her belief that enduring mistreatment is the price she pays for being allowed to stay near her son. She sacrifices her well-being for Stewie's stability, choosing to be the target so that Stewie can grow up in a relatively functional household, even if she personally suffers. The show's timeline regarding when Meg would have been pregnant aligns with periods where the show has been deliberately vague about family history. The Griffin family's past before the show started is rarely discussed in detail. We know some general facts but lack specifics about what happened year by year. This vagueness creates space for a teenage pregnancy to have occurred without contradicting established canon. If Meg was pregnant at 15, she would have had the baby right before or right around when the show's main timeline begins. The show's refusal to detail what happened in the years immediately before the series started could be deliberate avoidance of addressing when Meg was pregnant. Stewie's complete lack of resemblance to Peter supports the theory. Meg looks like Lois, Chris looks like Peter, but Stewie looks like neither parent. He has a football-shaped head and features that do not match either Lois or Peter. The show plays this for comedy, but it also raises questions about genetics. If Stewie is Meg's child by someone else, his lack of resemblance to Peter makes perfect biological sense. He is not Peter's son, so he does not look like Peter. His features come from Meg and his unknown father, neither of whom look like Peter, so Stewie's appearance reflects his actual parentage rather than the parentage everyone claims. The way other characters react to Stewie is revealing. People outside the family often seem confused about Stewie or uncertain how to relate to him. He is treated inconsistently as both a baby and as something else entirely. This confusion could stem from people subconsciously sensing that something is wrong with the official story about who Stewie is. If there are rumors in Quahog about Meg having had a baby, people might look at Stewie and wonder if he is actually that baby. Their inconsistent treatment of him reflects their uncertainty about his real identity and place in the family structure. The show has made jokes about Lois being too old to have babies or about her fertility declining, which would be accurate for a woman in her late 30s or 40s. These jokes make sense as commentary about Lois's age, but become more significant if she did not actually give birth to Stewie. The show calls attention to the implausibility of Lois having a baby at her age, which could be a hint that she did not have the baby but took over raising someone else's child. Comedy often works by stating truth in a way that seems like a joke, and jokes about Lois being too old for babies could be the show signaling that the official story does not make biological sense. Meg's reaction to babies and pregnancy in various episodes could reveal her trauma about her own experience. When the show has storylines involving pregnancy or babies, Meg's responses sometimes seem more emotionally intense than the situation warrants. She either becomes extremely uncomfortable or shows unusual interest in knowledge. Both responses could indicate someone who has personal experience with pregnancy and childbirth that she cannot openly discuss. Her reactions betray that this topic is not theoretical for her, but deeply personal and traumatic. The show could eventually reveal this truth as a way of explaining and partially redeeming the family's treatment of Meg. If the series ever approaches its ending or needs a massive, shocking reveal, discovering that Stewie is Meg's son would recontextualize everything about the Griffin family dynamics. It would explain why Meg is treated so differently, why the family's relationships are so dysfunctional, and why nobody has intervened in Meg's abuse despite it being obvious and severe. The reveal would not excuse the family's cruelty, but would explain it as stemming from a specific incident and ongoing cover-up, rather than being purely arbitrary cruelty toward an innocent child. Looking at the canonical evidence across hundreds of episodes, this theory finds support in age gaps that do not make sense, family dynamics that resemble resentment more than normal sibling conflict, jokes that explicitly state Stewie might be Meg's child, the family's established pattern of keeping massive secrets, and Meg's psychological damage that matches someone who gave up a child. The show has planted enough hints that the theory persists and grows more compelling the more carefully you examine the evidence. Whether the writers intended this interpretation or whether fans have constructed it from coincidental details does not matter because the textual support exists. Stewie's origins remain deliberately vague, Meg's past remains suspiciously blank, and the family's treatment of both characters makes more sense if they are hiding a devastating secret about who Stewie really is and who his mother really is. The theory transforms Family Guy from a show about a dysfunctional family into a show about a family broken by a teenage pregnancy they covered up, living with the consequences of that cover-up every day, while the real mother watches someone else raise her child and cannot say a word. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the theory that Meg and Chris actually died early on, and Peter has been imagining them ever since. One of the darkest theories circulating in Family Guy discussions suggests that Meg and Chris Griffin died when they were young children, and the teenage versions we see throughout the series exist only in Peter's traumatized imagination. According to this interpretation, Peter caused or failed to prevent his children's deaths years ago, and his broken mind created elaborate fantasy versions of them to cope with unbearable guilt and grief. The theory argues that Peter imagines what Meg and Chris would be like if they had survived and grown up, but his imagination is colored by his guilt, resulting in the twisted family dynamics we see on screen. This would explain why Meg is treated with such cruelty, why both children seem emotionally damaged, why the family relationships feel fundamentally wrong, and why Peter's behavior toward his children oscillates between neglect and occasional genuine emotion. When you examine the canonical evidence about Peter's mental state, the show's treatment of death and reality, and specific moments that hint at deep trauma underlying the Griffin family, this theory finds disturbing support in details that suggest Peter's grip on reality is far more tenuous than the show usually acknowledges. The foundation of this theory rests on identifying when and how Meg and Chris actually died before Peter began imagining their continued existence. The show has featured numerous episodes where Peter's negligence or stupidity puts his children in mortal danger. He has forgotten them in dangerous places, failed to supervise them properly, driven drunk with them in the car, and made countless decisions that should have resulted in their deaths. The theory suggests that one of these incidents actually did kill them in reality, but Peter's mind could not accept what he had done, so it constructed an alternate reality where they survived. Perhaps he crashed the car while driving drunk with young Meg and Chris inside. Perhaps he left them somewhere dangerous and they died while he was passed out or distracted. Perhaps they drowned, burned, or were killed in a household accident that Peter could have prevented. The specific method matters less than the fact that Peter's negligence led directly to their deaths, creating guilt so massive that his psyche shattered. Peter's established mental problems and tenuous grip on reality support the possibility that he could maintain elaborate delusions for years. The show has depicted Peter as having suffered brain damage, experiencing hallucinations, and demonstrating cognitive impairment so severe that he qualifies as mentally disabled in some episodes. He has conversations with inanimate objects that he believes are real. He cannot distinguish fantasy from reality in many situations. He has false memories and believes things happened that clearly did not happen. His mind is demonstrably unreliable, which means he is absolutely capable of constructing fantasy versions of dead children and believing they are real. The show has established Peter as someone whose perception of reality cannot be trusted, which creates the psychological foundation for this theory. The way Peter treats Meg becomes horrifyingly logical if she is a guilt projection rather than his real daughter. Peter tells Meg he does not love her, forgets her existence regularly, and treats her with contempt that goes beyond sitcom meanness into genuine cruelty. This treatment makes no sense if Meg is his actual living daughter, but it makes perfect sense if Meg is Peter's imagination's reconstruction of a dead child. In Peter's guilty mind, he does not deserve to have Meg, so his fantasy version of her is someone he cannot love properly. He pushes her away emotionally because his subconscious knows she should not exist. The abuse Meg endures is Peter's guilt, manifesting as cruelty toward the ghost he created. Every time he tells Meg she is worthless, he is really telling himself that he is worthless for what he did. Meg absorbs the punishment Peter believes he deserves, serving as a mirror for his self-loathing. Chris receives different but equally disturbing treatment that fits this theory. Peter shows more affection toward Chris than toward Meg, but he also treats Chris as stupid and incapable to an extreme degree. If Chris died young, Peter's imagination would have to invent what Chris would be like as a teenager based on limited information. Peter knew Chris as a child and extrapolated a teenage version, but his guilt and limited imagination resulted in a Chris who is mentally stunted and emotionally underdeveloped. Fantasy Chris remains childlike because Peter's memories of real Chris are frozen at whatever age he was when he died. Peter cannot fully imagine Chris as a complex teenager because he never got to see real Chris grow up. So imaginary Chris stays simple, innocent, and childish, even in a teenage body. The show's treatment of death and resurrection supports the idea that the living and dead exist on a continuum in Peter's mind. Characters die and come back regularly in Family Guy without explanation. Death is temporary, meaningless, and easily reversed. This casual relationship with mortality makes perfect sense if Peter's fantasy world is built around denying that death is permanent. He cannot accept that Meg and Chris are truly dead, so his constructed reality operates on rules where death can always be undone. Every time a character dies and returns, Peter's delusion reinforces itself with the idea that death is not final, and his children could still somehow be alive despite everything his subconscious knows. The age discrepancy between what Meg and Chris should be and what they are could indicate when they actually died. If Meg was 8 and Chris was 5 when they died, but Peter's delusion has been running for 9 years, his fantasy versions would now be 17 and 14. The children never age in the show despite years passing in real time, which makes sense if they are frozen at the ages Peter imagines them to be. Real children grow and change continuously, but imaginary children only change when Peter consciously updates his fantasy about them. He has imagined them at their current ages for so long that he cannot conceive of them aging further, so they remain perpetually 17 and 14 in his delusion. Lois's role in this scenario becomes crucial and deeply sad. If Meg and Chris died, Lois experienced that loss too and knows the children are dead. Her treatment of fantasy Meg could reflect her anger at Peter for creating these delusions and forcing her to participate in them. When Lois is cruel to Meg, she might be expressing rage at Peter for making her interact with this ghost of their dead daughter. Alternatively, Lois might have broken down completely after losing her children, and now participates willingly in Peter's delusion because living in the fantasy is preferable to facing reality. She plays along with Peter's imagined Meg and Chris because the alternative is confronting that her children are dead and her husband killed them. The delusion has become necessary for both parents' survival. Brian's knowledge of the truth would explain his complicated relationship with the family and his drinking. If Brian was present when Meg and Chris died, he knows they are dead but chooses not to confront Peter's delusion because breaking it would destroy Peter completely. Brian watches Peter interact with children who are not there, and Brian plays along to protect his friend from truth too terrible to face. This participation in the lie weighs on Brian's conscience and contributes to his alcoholism and depression. He is complicit in maintaining a mass delusion, and he drinks to numb the guilt about letting Peter live in fantasy rather than helping him face reality and heal. Stewie's existence as a real baby in this scenario becomes a source of both hope and terror for Peter. Stewie is the only child who is definitely real because he was born after Meg and Chris died. Peter can interact with Stewie knowing he is touching an actual living child rather than a projection of guilt. This would explain why Peter largely ignores Stewie despite him being his youngest child. Stewie is real, which means Stewie could die just like Meg and Chris died, so Peter maintains emotional distance as a protection mechanism. He cannot allow himself to love Stewie too much, because losing another real child would shatter even the delusion that keeps him functional. Meanwhile, Stewie's genius and dangerous technology represent real threats that Peter's traumatized mind cannot fully process, so he treats Stewie as less important than the imaginary children he has already lost. The show has featured episodes where Peter's perception of reality is explicitly shown to be false or distorted. He has experienced extended hallucinations, false memories, and alternate realities that he believes are real. These episodes demonstrate that Peter's mind is capable of constructing elaborate fictional scenarios and inhabiting them completely. If he can hallucinate entire storylines within single episodes, he can certainly hallucinate ongoing versions of his dead children across years. Each episode could represent Peter living through another day in his delusion, creating scenarios and adventures for his imaginary children because his mind cannot stop trying to give them the lives they lost. Meg and Chris's lack of friends, social connections, and lives outside the Griffin house could indicate they are not real. Real teenagers have complex social worlds, including school friends, romantic interests, and activities independent of their parents. Meg and Chris occasionally have storylines about school or friends, but these relationships never develop depth or continuity. People outside the family barely acknowledge Meg and Chris or treat them as if they barely exist. This could be because other people do not see them at all. When Peter imagines taking his children places, other characters play along or ignore the situation because they see Peter talking to empty space, but choose not to confront his obvious mental illness. Quahog has learned to accommodate Peter's delusion rather than challenge it. The theory explains specific episodes where Meg or Chris temporarily leave the family or disappear. When Meg runs away or when Chris goes missing, these storylines represent Peter's delusion fragmenting temporarily as his subconscious tries to acknowledge the truth. His fantasy children disappear because part of his mind remembers they are actually gone. He then constructs elaborate scenarios to bring them back because he cannot maintain the fantasy without them. Every departure and return mirrors Peter's consciousness, fighting between accepting reality and retreating into delusion, with delusion always winning in the end. Certain episodes have shown Peter having flashbacks to when Meg and Chris were younger, and these memories often feel emotionally different from the show's usual tone. They are tinged with sadness, nostalgia, and loss that seems disproportionate to normal childhood memories. If these flashbacks are Peter's mind accessing real memories of his children before they died, the emotional weight makes sense. He is remembering the last time he saw them truly alive and happy, before whatever incident took them away. These flashbacks feel melancholy because they are Peter's mind trying to preserve genuine memories of real children, even while his current delusion maintains that those children still exist and have grown up. The family's complete lack of extended family involvement or outside intervention in their dysfunction could indicate that people who knew the real Meg and Chris cannot bear to participate in Peter's delusion. Lois's parents know their grandchildren are dead and probably cannot visit because seeing Peter interact with imaginary versions of them is too painful. Friends and relatives maintain distance from the Griffin family because Peter's obvious mental illness and the family's participation in his delusion is disturbing to witness. The Griffins live in isolation not because they prefer it, but because Peter's breakdown has alienated everyone who knew the truth about what happened to the children. The show's inconsistent continuity regarding Meg and Chris could reflect Peter's imagination constantly revising and updating their characteristics because he lacks concrete reality to anchor them. Real people have consistent personalities that develop gradually over time. Imaginary people change based on what the imaginer needs them to be in any given moment. Meg's personality shifts between episodes from meek victim to angry rebel to desperately needy because she is whatever Peter's guilt needs her to be in that moment. Chris fluctuates between sweet, innocent boy and disturbed, troubled teen because Peter cannot maintain a consistent image of a son he never got to see grow up. Their inconsistency is not bad writing, but accurate portrayal of how imaginary people lack the coherent development of real individuals. Episodes featuring Meg or Chris in dangerous situations take on new meaning as Peter's subconscious repeatedly trying to process their actual deaths. When Meg is kidnapped, when Chris is threatened, when either child faces mortality, Peter is forcing himself to relive trauma by imagining his children in danger again. His mind compulsively returns to scenarios where his children are at risk because it is trying to process the real scenario where they were at risk and he failed to save them. He constructs these storylines unconsciously as exposure therapy, trying to desensitize himself to the trauma, but he always resolves them with the children surviving because accepting their deaths remains impossible. The way Meg and Chris interact with each other lacks the genuine sibling dynamic that real brother and sister would develop over years of living together. Their relationship is superficial with few shared memories or inside jokes. They exist in parallel rather than being truly connected. This makes sense if they are both products of the same imagination rather than two separate people who have actually grown up together. Peter imagines them as individuals but cannot fully imagine the relationship between them because that requires a level of detail and consistency beyond what his traumatized mind can maintain. They are separate delusions rather than delusions that interact naturally with each other. The show has made jokes about Meg being forgettable or invisible, including an episode where the family literally forgets she exists. These jokes are played for comedy, but they also hint that Meg's existence is tenuous and easily erased. If she is imaginary, she would be easily forgotten because she lacks the substance and presence of a real person. Peter's mind sometimes cannot maintain the energy required to imagine her, so she temporarily disappears from the family's consciousness until Peter's delusion strengthens again and brings her back. Her invisibility is not a quirk of her personality, but a feature of her being a projection that sometimes fades when the projector's power weakens. Chris's episodes that focus on him discovering disturbing truths or encountering evil monkeys and other threatening figures could represent fragments of reality breaking into Peter's delusion. The evil monkey that lives in Chris's closet might be a manifestation of truth trying to emerge, a symbolic representation of the terrible secret the family is hiding. Chris sees threatening things that other family members dismiss because fantasy Chris exists closer to the boundary between Peter's delusion and reality. As an imagined version of a dead child, Chris sometimes channels truth that Peter's conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. The show's treatment of Peter's father, Francis Griffin, is relevant because Francis clearly disapproved of how Peter raised his children. Francis's death in the series could connect to the theory if Francis knew about Meg and Chris's deaths and blamed Peter. Perhaps Francis could not forgive Peter for what happened to his grandchildren and died still angry at his son. Peter's complicated relationship with his father's memory includes guilt that might extend beyond their personal conflicts to encompass Francis's knowledge of Peter's greatest failure as a father. When Peter deals with his father's ghost or memory, he is also dealing with the voice of paternal judgment about the children he lost. Lois's occasional breakdowns and expressions of being overwhelmed by motherhood take on darker meaning if she is pretending to mother children who do not exist. When she screams about how difficult her life is or how much her children exhaust her, she might be expressing the genuine exhaustion of maintaining Peter's delusion while also grieving her real dead children. She plays the role of mother to ghosts every day while remembering what it was like to mother real living children. The performance required to sustain Peter's fantasy while processing her own grief would be absolutely crushing and would explain her moments of complete breakdown. The theory suggests that various neighbors and acquaintances in Quahog either cannot see Meg and Chris at all or choose to ignore the obvious signs of Peter's delusion to avoid confronting uncomfortable truth. When Meg goes to school or Chris has interactions with other kids, these could be either Peter imagining scenarios where his children still have normal lives, or other people indulging Peter's delusion by pretending to interact with his imaginary children. Quahog as a whole has decided that maintaining Peter's fantasy is kinder than forcing him to face that he killed his children, so the entire town participates in a collective fiction. The show's frequent road trip and adventure episodes with the family could represent Peter's attempts to create happy memories with imaginary versions of children he never got to take on real adventures. He imagines elaborate vacations and experiences with Meg and Chris because he is trying to give them the childhood they lost. Every family adventure is Peter's guilt-driven attempt to compensate for the life he took from them by imagining a better, more exciting life than they actually had. The adventures are often chaotic and dangerous because Peter's traumatized mind cannot imagine purely positive experiences. His guilt ensures that even his fantasies include elements of threat and failure. Certain episodes have shown alternate timelines or realities where the Griffin family is configured differently, and sometimes in these alternates, Meg and Chris do not exist, or exist very differently. These alternate realities could be Peter's mind briefly glimpsing actual reality where his children are dead before the delusion reasserts itself and brings them back. When the show depicts reality shifting or multiple timelines, it is showing Peter's consciousness flickering between delusion and truth, with delusion always ultimately winning because truth is unbearable. The episode where Meg finally stands up to the family and explains that she accepts their abuse to keep the family stable takes on devastating new meaning in this context. If Meg is Peter's guilt projection, this speech represents Peter's subconscious understanding that his fantasy Meg exists specifically to absorb the punishment he believes he deserves. She articulates the psychological function she serves in his delusion. She exists to be hurt because Peter needs to hurt himself for what he did, and hurting imaginary Meg is how he accomplishes that self-punishment, while avoiding direct self-harm that would end his ability to maintain the fantasy. Chris's artistic talent and interest in drawing could represent Peter's subconscious trying to preserve what real Chris loved. If actual Chris enjoyed art before he died, Peter ensures fantasy Chris maintains that interest as a way of honoring his real son's memory. The characteristics Peter gives his imagined children are likely based on who they actually were, filtered through years of grief and guilt. Fantasy Meg and Chris are distorted versions of real Meg and Chris, exaggerated and damaged by trauma, but still containing kernels of truth about who those children were before Peter's negligence destroyed them. The show, continuing for over 20 years with Meg and Chris, never aging makes perfect sense if they died when they were young, and Peter has been imagining them at fixed ages for decades. Time passes in the real world, but Peter's delusion is frozen at the point where he constructed these fantasy children. He decided what ages they should be when he created the fantasy, and they remain those ages forever because his trauma cannot allow them to develop further. Real children who were 8 and 5 when they died 20 years ago would now be 28 and 25 if they had lived, but Peter's imagination keeps them perpetually 17 and 14, because that is as far as he can stretch his fantasy. Looking at the canonical evidence, this theory finds support in Peter's established mental instability, the show's casual treatment of death and reality, the family's dysfunctional dynamics that make more sense as guilt-driven delusion than as actual family relationships, and the specific ways Meg and Chris are treated that suggest they exist more as concepts than as fully realized people. The theory transforms every episode from a comedy about a dysfunctional family into a tragedy about a man who killed his children and constructed an elaborate fantasy world to avoid accepting what he did. Every joke at Meg's expense becomes Peter's guilt punishing itself. Every moment of Chris's innocence becomes Peter trying to preserve what he destroyed. Every family adventure becomes a desperate attempt to give dead children the life they lost. The show is not what happens to the Griffin family, but what Peter imagines happens to the fantasy versions of a family he destroyed, playing out in his broken mind episode after episode, year after year, with no possibility of healing. Because healing would require facing truth that would destroy him completely. Meg and Chris exist as Peter's elaborate apology and ongoing punishment, ghosts he created to haunt himself forever. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.